Cornelius Turner didn't knock. He threw open the bedroom door so hard it cracked against the wall, and the sound of it, that sharp, ugly crack, was the first thing Abigail heard on the morning her life ended, and though she didn't know it yet, began again. "Get out of this house." His voice was flat. Not angry. Flat was worse. "You have until sundown." Abigail was still holding her husband's pillow. Marcus had been buried 3 days ago. The dirt on his grave was still fresh enough to smell. She started. "You are not a Turner," Cornelius said. "You never were. You brought nothing into this family, and you carried nothing forward." His eyes moved over her body, her wide hips, her heavy arms, her grief-swollen face, with the particular contempt of a man who had decided, long before this moment, exactly what she was worth. "Sundown," he repeated and walked out. "If you've ever been made to feel like you don't deserve the space you stand in, stay with me. This story is going to make your blood boil, break your heart, and then, I promise you, it is going to set something on fire inside you that you forgot was there." Subscribe to this channel and follow Abigail's story all the way to the end, because what this woman does next will shock you. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bedroom Abigail stood in had never really been hers. That was the first thought that came to her after Cornelius left, which surprised her because she'd expected to feel terror. Instead, she felt something quieter and more devastating. The recognition that she had been a guest in this house for 2 years and had simply failed to notice. The embroidered curtains were Eleanor Turner's, Marcus's mother, dead 7 years and still claiming every window. The dresser was dark cherry wood that Cornelius had hauled from his father's farm in Kentucky. Even the quilt on the bed had been stitched by some Turner aunt whose name Abigail had never managed to learn. She set the pillow down carefully, the way you set down something borrowed. She was 26 years old. She weighed, well, she knew exactly what she weighed because Cornelius had told her, loudly, at Marcus's funeral, when he'd pulled her aside behind the churchyard elm and said, "I hope you understand that a woman your size was never what this family needed," as though her body had somehow contributed to Marcus catching fever and dying in 4 days. She was 231 pounds, and she was a widow, and she had until sundown. She did not cry. She would cry later, in a place no one could see her, when she had earned that privacy. Right now she had work to do. She found the burlap sack that she'd brought from her father's house when she'd married Marcus. It was the only thing in the room that was unambiguously hers. Her mother had sewn it from feed bags and given it to her the morning of the wedding with a look that meant just in case. Abigail's mother had understood men like Cornelius Turner before Abigail had ever met one. She packed what she could: a change of clothes, her mother's bone-handled knife, a tin of hard biscuits she'd baked 2 days ago and hadn't been able to eat since Marcus died, her sewing kit, and at the bottom of the dresser drawer, wrapped in a piece of brown cloth, 5 silver coins. Everything she'd managed to keep separate from the household money over 2 years of careful, quiet saving. 5 coins. She held them in her palm and thought about what they could buy. She walked out the front door at noon, not sundown, noon. She was not going to wait around so Cornelius Turner could feel like he'd done her any kind of favor by giving her time. The town of Harwick sat at the base of the northern ridge, and it had roughly 400 people and roughly 400 opinions about everything and everyone in it. Abigail had learned this in the 2 years she'd lived there, arriving as Marcus Turner's wife, which had given her a certain amount of standing, and departing now as Cornelius Turner's problem, which gave her none. She walked down the main street with her burlap sack over her shoulder, and she watched people notice her, not in the way that people notice something new, in the way that people notice something they've already classified. She saw it in the way Sarah Plum, who ran the dry goods store, paused her sweeping and watched from the doorway without speaking. She saw it in the way 2 men outside the grain mill exchanged a glance. She was the large woman whose husband had died and who was now, apparently visibly, being put out, and Harwick was already constructing the story it would tell about her. She needed somewhere to go. That much was simple enough. She did not have family in Harwick. Her own parents were a 4-day walk south, which might as well have been the moon. She had a little money and a big body and the kind of face that people described as handsome when they were being generous and unfortunate when they thought you couldn't hear them. What she needed was property. The thought arrived in her mind fully formed, which surprised her. She hadn't planned it. But the moment she thought it, she understood that it was the only thought worth having. Begging someone for a room would make her dependent. Renting would spend her coins in weeks. The only thing that would keep her from being absorbed back into someone else's story was a piece of ground she could call her own. She stopped walking in front of the land office, looked up at the sign, went inside. Emmett Doyle ran the Harwick Land Office with the particular combination of laziness and self-importance that characterized men who had been given small amounts of power in large amounts of isolation. He looked up from his desk when Abigail came in, and his expression moved through 3 phases very quickly: recognition, evaluation, conclusion, and then settled into the smile of a man who has already decided how this conversation will go. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "heard you'd be needing assistance." Word travels fast, she thought. Of course it does. "I'm looking to purchase land," she said. "Something with a structure already on it, if possible." With a structure. He wrote something in his ledger that she couldn't see. "How much are you working with?" she told him. 5 coins. She watched his face as she said it, and she saw in the shift of his eyebrows the subtle update to his internal ledger. Less than I thought, more than nothing. Emmett leaned back in his chair. "Well, there is one property." He said it the way you say something when you're about to describe a disaster. "Up on the North Ridge, about 3 miles out, old Garner cabin." He paused. "Nobody's lived there in about 6 years. The Garner family built it, and then the husband died and the wife took the children back east, and nobody's bought it since because—" Another pause. "Frankly, Mrs. Turner, it's not in what you'd call good repair." "How much?" He named a figure that was exactly 5 silver coins. She put the coins on his desk before he finished speaking. He blinked. "You understand the condition of the—" "I'll need the deed written today," she said. "And directions." Huts. She smelled the cabin before she saw it. That particular smell, old wet wood and rotting thatch and cold ash, and the particular funk of a structure that has been fighting the weather alone for years and slowly losing, hit her on the trail about 100 yards before the building came into view. Then she came through the tree line and saw it and stopped. Oh. The word that came to mind was not a good one. The Garner cabin listed to the left. Not dramatically, not so far that you'd expect it to fall in the next hour, but enough that a plumb line from the roof peak would land several feet outside the foundation. The chimney had partially collapsed. The upper third of it was just gone, replaced by a rough wooden cap someone had apparently nailed on in a hurry some years ago, and which had since given up any pretense of keeping out the weather. 2 of the 4 shutters were missing. The door was there but hung at a significant angle, suggesting that the frame had shifted over the winter. She stood there and looked at it for a long time. Then she walked up and pushed the door open and went inside. The interior was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 14. The floor was puncheon. Split logs laid flat, and several of them had warped so badly they'd heaved upward, creating a surface that was more ridge and valley than floor. The ceiling had a dark stain spreading from the fireplace corner that told the story of years of smoke with nowhere to go. There was a sleeping loft, just boards over a pair of rough beams, and when Abigail climbed up to check it, she found that 2 of the loft boards had rotted through entirely. She came back down and stood in the center of the warped floor and looked at the crooked walls and the gaping chimney hole and the hanging door and the missing shutters and the darkened ceiling, and she thought very carefully for a moment. Then she said out loud to nobody, "All right, that was all. Just all right." Because there was nobody to be brave for and nobody to be dramatic for. And what she actually felt was not despair, but something more like the grimness that comes after despair burns off and leaves you with just the facts of the situation and the question of what you're going to do about them. She was going to fix it. That was what she was going to do. She didn't know yet how she was going to fix it. She didn't know which problem to start with or where materials would come from, or whether her body, which people had spent her entire life treating as a liability, would hold up to what she was about to ask of it. She didn't know any of that. But she knew that this door, this hanging, crooked, cold-letting door, was hers. For the first time in her life, she had a door that was hers. She pulled it shut. It stuck halfway. She shouldered it the rest of the way, and it closed with a sound like a sigh. The first night was the worst. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the specific quality of the cold, not just temperature, but presence, a cold that seemed to be interested in her, that found its way through every gap in the wall and the holes in the chimney cap and the spaces between the warped floorboards and assembled itself around her with patient, comprehensive thoroughness. She had her change of clothes and her coat, and she put on everything she owned, and then she lay on the loft floor, avoiding the rotted-through boards. And she pulled her burlap sack over her feet because she had nothing else. And she told herself very clearly that she was not going to die of cold in a cabin she had bought 6 hours ago because that would be profoundly stupid. She didn't die. But she didn't sleep much either. When the first gray light came through the shutterless window, she lay there and took inventory. Body, tired, cold, stiff, but operational. Hands, she stretched them and flexed them. They hurt, but they worked. Chimney, first priority, because without heat, she would lose the ability to work, and then she would lose everything else. Floor, second priority, because a turned ankle on a heaved log would be a catastrophe. Walls, third. Door, fourth, because the door wasn't perfect, but it closed, and closed was enough for now. She got up. She ate half a hard biscuit. She went outside and looked at the chimney. The chimney was stone, field stone, laid with clay mortar, and it had been built by someone who had known what they were doing. The problem wasn't the foundation or the lower two-thirds. The problem was that the clay mortar at the top had cracked and washed out over 6 winters, and the top third of the chimney had simply migrated. A few stones had fallen. Others had shifted. The cap someone had nailed on was a section of split log, and it was rotted, and a bird had built a nest in the gap between the log and the stones, and that nest was now blocking the flue. Abigail looked at this situation and considered it carefully. She had no mortar. She had no extra stones. She had no ladder. She did have her mother's bone-handled knife, her considerable upper body strength, which people had spent years failing to recognize as strength because they were too busy failing to recognize it as anything other than fat, her brain, and about 6 hours of daylight. She found the fallen chimney stones first. They were scattered around the base of the cabin, half buried in leaves and frost. She dug them out with her hands, counting them, matching them back against the gap in the chimney stack by eye. She had enough, or close to enough. Getting up to the chimney top was the problem. She walked into the tree line and found a pine with a low first branch, and she hauled herself up, heaving, inelegant, her arms screaming, and she got up 3 limbs and looked at the angle of the cabin roof. She'd need something to lean against the wall. She needed a pole or a plank. She looked around the cabin exterior. She needed that section of split-rail fence that had apparently been part of a corral someone had built and abandoned, which was lying in 3 pieces against the back wall. She dragged the longest piece around front. She leaned it against the cabin wall. She tested it. It bowed under her weight, but didn't break. And then she climbed it. It was not graceful. It was not graceful at all. She was a large woman climbing a piece of rotting fence rail, leaning against a lopsided cabin. And when she reached the roofline, her arms were shaking, and there was a 4-inch scrape along her left palm from where the wood had bitten her. And she was breathing in the heavy, audible way that the people of Harwick would have found extremely satisfying if they could have seen it. She didn't let herself think about them. She pulled herself onto the roof, and it groaned under her, but it held. She crawled to the chimney. The bird nest came out in pieces. She dug it out with her knife, the dead grass and mud and feathers coming apart in her hands. Beneath it, the flue was intact. She put her face close to the opening and felt for air movement and found it. Good. The structure was sound. She repointed the gaps between the shifted stones with clay. She dug the clay from the creek bank 20 yards from the cabin, carrying it up in the tin that had held her biscuits and packing it into the cracks with her fingers, forcing it in as deep as she could, smoothing it with her thumb. She replaced 3 stones that had fallen out, setting them back in their mortared beds, pressing clay in around them. The new mortar would need time to cure, and the first fire would need to be small, and she would need to watch it. She came back down off the roof in the late afternoon, less gracefully than she'd gone up, ending in a kind of controlled fall from the fence rail that left her sitting on the frozen ground for a full 2 minutes before she decided her ankle was sprained but not broken. She sat in the dirt of her own yard, and her hands were caked with clay, and her back was a solid complaint, and her left palm was bleeding through the clay she'd packed into the scrape. She did not feel good. She felt wrecked, but the chimney was done. She built her first fire that night with wood from the fallen fence rail, and she watched it with the obsessive attention of someone who cannot afford a mistake. The smoke drew upward. The chimney pulled. The clay mortar didn't crack. Wouldn't know for certain for a few more fires, but it held. The room began, very slowly, to release the cold it had been storing for 6 years. Abigail sat on the least warped section of floor and held her hands toward the fire and let herself, just for a moment, feel the specific relief of one thing done. Then she heard footsteps on the path outside. She was up before she'd made a conscious decision to stand, her hand on her knife, her back to the fire so the light wouldn't show in her eyes. The footsteps stopped. Then a knock. 3 knocks, measured, not aggressive. "Girl," a voice said. Old, female, dry as paper. "I can see your chimney smoke from my place up the ridge, and I want to know if you're a fool or a suicide." Abigail opened the door. The woman on the other side was old enough that estimating her age felt impolite. She was small and thin and dressed in layers of mismatched wool, and she was carrying a clay jar and looking at Abigail with black eyes that contained no warmth but quite a lot of intelligence. "Which is it?" the woman said. "Neither," Abigail said. "I live here." The woman looked past her at the interior of the cabin. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, like she was making a determination. "Hazel Boone," she said. "I'm your neighbor, up the ridge a quarter mile." She held out the clay jar. "Bean soup. You look like you haven't eaten." Abigail took the jar. "Abigail Turner." "I know who you are," Hazel Boone said. "Cornelius Turner's dead son's wife, the one he threw out this morning." She said it without inflection, as simple fact. "Half the town's expecting you to come back down that mountain inside a week. The other half's expecting you won't come down at all." She tilted her head slightly. "The chimney work. You do that yourself today?" "Yes." Hazel looked at the chimney again. Something moved in her face, not quite approval, but adjacent to it. "Mortar needs a week before you trust it. Keep the fire small." She turned to go. "Thank you," Abigail said. "For the soup." Hazel didn't turn back. "Save your thanks. You're going to need that energy for the floor." She was already walking up the dark path. "Those heaved puncheons will snap an ankle before Christmas if you don't deal with them. Come see me tomorrow morning, and I'll tell you how." And then she was gone, just her voice trailing back through the trees. Small fires. Abigail closed the door. She sat back down by the fire with the jar of bean soup, and she ate it very slowly, making herself stop before the jar was empty, even though she was hungry enough to eat the clay it was made from. Ration. She had almost nothing. She needed to be careful. She thought about Hazel Boone's voice, dry and direct and carrying no pity. She thought about how different that was from the people of Harwick, who looked at her with pity or contempt or that particular combination of the two that expressed itself as concern. She thought about Cornelius Turner sitting in his large house in the middle of town with its solid walls and its good chimney and its proper floor. She thought, "He put me out here to disappear." Then she thought, "All right." Then she lay down by the fire and slept. Properly slept, for the first time in 4 days. And the chimney she had rebuilt with her own hands and her own clay drew steadily above her while the temperature outside dropped and kept dropping, and the frontier winter came down off the ridge like it was looking for something to break. It didn't find what it was looking for. Not that night. But it was patient. And so was she. The floor nearly killed her on the 4th day. She'd been working her way across the room methodically, prying up the worst of the heaved puncheons with a length of iron rod she'd found buried under leaves at the back of the cabin, left behind by the Garner family, forgotten, and now the most useful thing she owned. The process was straightforward enough in theory. Get the rod under the edge of a warped log, lever it up, figure out why it had heaved, pack clay or wedge a flat stone underneath to level it, set it back down. Repeat. In practice, it was brutal work, the kind of work that used every muscle in a body simultaneously and then asked for a little more. And by the 3rd day, her hands had developed blisters on top of blisters, the new ones forming under the old skin before the old skin had finished tearing. On the 4th day, she was working on a log near the back wall that had heaved nearly 3 inches, the worst one, the one she'd been avoiding because she knew it would be bad. And she got the rod under it and leaned her full weight on the lever, and the log came up fast and wrong, pivoting instead of lifting, and the end of it caught her right shin with the full torque of 231 pounds of woman and 6 feet of iron rod behind it. She went down. Not gracefully. She hit the puncheon floor with both hands and one knee and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She lay there for a moment. the cold floor against her palms, her shin screaming, the fire crackling in the chimney she'd repaired with her own hands and her own clay, and which was still, 4 days later, drawing cleanly. She pressed her fingers against her shin through the cloth and felt carefully. Not broken. The bone was solid under the pain. Bruised, badly, maybe a hairline. She wouldn't know for certain for a day or two. But she could flex her ankle, and she could bend her knee, and when she very carefully tried to put weight on it, the pain was spectacular but survivable. She sat on the floor of her cabin and breathed through her nose until the worst of the white-hot shock faded down to something merely miserable. Then she got up. She finished the log. It took her an extra hour because she had to rest the leg every few minutes, but she finished it, and when she set the puncheon back level in its bed, she stood on it and it didn't rock, and that was enough. That evening, Hazel Boone came down the path as she had every evening that week. Not announced, not invited, just appearing at the door with something practical. A tin of rendered fat for waterproofing the log walls, a handful of dried herbs she identified by their function rather than their names, a length of rope made from braided rawhide that she said Abigail would find uses for. She always looked at the progress Abigail had made without commenting on it directly. She would say things like, "The chimney's drawing better," or "You got the north wall," and then wait. And Abigail had learned that those were observations that contained questions. That night, Hazel came in and looked at the floor and said, "You got most of it." "One more section by the door," Abigail said. She was sitting with her legs stretched out toward the fire, her shin wrapped in a strip of cloth soaked in the rendered fat, which Hazel had told her worked as well on bruises as it did on wood. "Tomorrow." Hazel's eyes moved to the leg. Not with concern exactly. Hazel Boone did not appear to traffic in concern, but with the evaluating look of someone calculating whether a problem is going to become a larger problem. "How bad?" "I'll walk on it." "That's not what I asked." Abigail looked at her. "Bad enough. Not broken." Hazel sat down on the stool that Abigail had found in the loft and repaired with a new rung cut from a pine branch. She folded her hands in her lap. "You need to slow down," she said. "I need to finish the floor before the hard freeze. And if you turn that bruise into a break, you won't finish anything." They looked at each other. Hazel's black eyes had that quality Abigail was coming to recognize. Not unkind exactly, but utterly unwilling to soften a fact just because the fact was uncomfortable. It reminded her, in a painful way, of her mother. Her mother had been like that. Her mother had also been right, more often than Abigail had wanted to admit. "I'll be careful," Abigail said. Hazel made a sound that was not agreement. She reached into the large pocket of her coat and produced a small jar of something dark and thick. "Comfrey and beeswax," she said, setting it on the floor beside Abigail. "For the hands. You're going to lose function in those fingers if you don't start managing the skin." Abigail looked at her hands. The blisters had broken and reformed so many times that the skin on her palms had passed through several stages and arrived at something that resembled old saddle leather. She'd stopped noticing the pain in them specifically because it had become the background noise of every moment. "Thank you," she said. Hazel waved the thanks away, the same way she always did. Then she said unexpectedly, "My son will be coming up the ridge day after tomorrow. He's the blacksmith in town. He has some tools you might find useful." Abigail frowned. "I can't pay for tools." "I didn't say anything about paying." Hazel stood up. "He's coming up to deliver my winter stores. I'll have him bring what he has spare." She pulled her coat tighter. "He won't say much. Don't let that bother you. He's been that way since his wife passed." She left. The door stuck halfway as it always did, and Abigail heard her push it the rest of the way from outside, and then the sound of her footsteps up the path, and then nothing. Abigail uncapped the comfrey jar and began working the ointment into her palms. It smelled like earth and something bitter underneath. Her hands looked, she thought, like they belonged to someone 30 years older, someone who had spent 30 years earning them. She supposed she was trying to earn 30 years in a few weeks, and that had its own logic, even if it hurt. She thought about Cornelius Turner sitting in his house in town, and she thought about what his hands looked like. Soft. She'd noticed that at the funeral, the handshakes, the condolences, the way his grip was firm, but the skin was smooth and uncalloused. A man who had hired other people to do the work that made hands hard. She looked at her own destroyed palms and felt, under the pain, something that wasn't quite pride. It was adjacent to pride. It was the feeling of someone who is becoming, slowly and at great cost, exactly who they need to be. She put more comfrey on her hands and fed a log to the fire and went to sleep. Silas Boone arrived 2 days later in the early afternoon with a mule loaded with Hazel's winter stores and a look on his face that communicated with great efficiency that he had not been asked about this errand and had mixed feelings about it. I was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of compactness that came from years of physical work distributing weight evenly rather than building it up. He had his mother's black eyes, but where hers were watchful, his were careful, which was a different quality. He unloaded Hazel's stores at the old woman's cabin up the ridge without conversation, and then he came down to Abigail's cabin with a canvas-wrapped bundle under his arm and stood outside the door and called her name once, neutrally, the way you'd knock on a door that was standing open. She came out. He was already unwrapping the bundle. Inside were a hatchet, well used but sharp, a hand auger for boring holes in wood, 2 cold chisels of different sizes, a flat-bladed draw knife for shaping timber, and a coil of good iron wire that could be used for binding or repair or approximately 20 other things she could think of immediately. She looked at the tools and then looked at him. He was looking somewhere to the left of her face, which she recognized as the behavior of a person who is uncomfortable in managing it by focusing on the middle distance. "Your mother said you had these spare," she said. "Mostly." He had a voice like his mother, dry, without ornament. "The auger's mine, but you can keep it until spring. The draw knife belonged to a man who doesn't need it anymore." She wanted to ask about the man who didn't need it anymore, but something in the set of his jaw told her that particular door was not open. "I'll take good care of them," she said. He nodded. He started to turn back toward his mule, and then he stopped. He was looking at the cabin wall, the north-facing side, which she'd spent the last 2 days re-chinked with a mixture of clay and dried grass packed into the gaps between the logs. His eyes moved along the chinking, slow and systematic, the way a craftsman looks at work. "You do all that yourself?" he said. "Yes." He kept looking. "The consistency's off on the lower section. You mix the clay too wet, it'll shrink out when it dries." She had already noticed this. She had noticed it this morning and had spent breakfast hating herself for it. "I know," she said. "I'm going to rework it." He looked at her then, not at the middle distance, but at her briefly, with those careful black eyes. He seemed to be recalculating something. Then he looked away again. "Try adding more dry grass to the lower batch. Gives it body." He got back on his mule and rode down the path. He didn't say goodbye. She didn't expect him to. She picked up the hatchet and turned it in her hand. Good weight. Someone had taken care of it. The edge was clean, no rust, the handle tight in the socket. She thought of the man who didn't need it anymore and felt a complicated sorrow for someone she'd never known. Then she went back to work. The wall chinking took 3 more days. She dug new clay from a different section of the creek bank, deeper clay, less sand in it, and she mixed it drier the way Silas had suggested, adding handfuls of dried grass until the mixture held its shape when she pressed it into a ball. She worked it into the lower section gaps in the north wall, packing it in with her thumbs, smoothing it flush with the log faces. She did the same on the east wall. The west wall she'd have to save. There was a section near the foundation where 2 logs had partially separated, and that needed more than chinking. It needed a wedge or a shim of something solid, and she didn't have the right material yet. Hazel, coming down one evening, looked at the rechinking and said, "Better?" That was all. But from Hazel, that was significant. "The west wall's got a problem," Abigail said. 2 logs spread. I need something solid to shim them." "My son has scrap iron at the smithy," Hazel said. "Flat pieces, offcuts from wheelwork. He'd have something." "I can't keep asking." "You're not asking. I'm telling you what he has." Hazel looked at her with those patient black eyes. "Silas doesn't give things he doesn't want to give. If he didn't want to help, he'd have sent the tools up with the mule unaccompanied." Abigail thought about that. "He doesn't like coming up here." "He doesn't like going anywhere much," Hazel said. "His wife died 2 years ago. He goes where he needs to go and comes back, and that's his life right now." She paused. "He noticed your chinking. He mentioned it when he came back to town." "What did he say about it?" Hazel's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Almost. "That you'd use too much water in the clay, which for Silas is a substantial amount of conversation about a woman he's met once." She turned toward the path. "I'll tell him about the west wall." Abigail watched her go and thought, Hazel Boone manages everyone around her with the efficiency of someone who's been doing it for 40 years and has simply stopped pretending otherwise. It was not an unkind observation. It was, in fact, the most reassuring thing she could think of, because it meant that Hazel's attention was intentional and not accidental, and that whatever the old woman was building up here on the North Ridge, she had decided Abigail was part of it. Silas came back the following week with 2 flat iron plates, each about 6 inches wide and a 1/4 inch thick, cut from some larger piece and cleaned of scale. He didn't knock on the door this time. She heard the mule on the path and came outside, and he was already at the west wall looking at the log separation with his head tilted slightly, the way he'd looked at the chinking. "Here," he said, and handed her the plates. She looked at the gap and then at the plates. "I need to trim them to fit the angle." "I know." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flat file. "You'll want to take the corners off the edges, or they'll work loose when the logs shift." "Do they shift much?" "In this climate, yes. Every freeze-thaw cycle moves them. You want the shims to move with the wood, not fight it." He handed her the file. "Bevel the top edge too, so water runs off instead of sitting." She stood there holding the iron plates and the file and looking at the gap in the west wall, and then she looked at him. He was doing that thing again, the careful middle distance. But there was something different about it today. He wasn't uncomfortable exactly. He was, she searched for the right word, concentrating. The way someone concentrates when they're present in a moment they weren't expecting to be present in. "Do you want to show me how?" she said. I was quiet for a moment, then, "I've got time." He spent 2 hours at the west wall. He showed her how to assess the angle of the gap, not just the visible spread, but the direction of the lean, which determined where you place the shim for maximum resistance. He showed her how to work the file across the iron plate, the right pressure and angle, so the bevel came out clean. He showed her how to drive the shim with a mallet without splitting the wood. You never hit iron directly into wet wood. You needed a hardwood intermediate, a short piece of dense hickory, and he produced one from his coat pocket as though he'd been expecting to need it. She paid attention to all of it with the intensity she applied to everything now, because she could not afford to learn anything twice. Her body was a resource she was rationing, not just the physical capacity, but the time, because winter was coming and she could feel the cold lengthening each night like something stretching its muscles and preparing. When the shims were in, Silas stepped back and looked at the wall. The logs were solid. The gap was closed. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and pushed, testing, and the wall didn't give. "That'll hold," he said. "Thank you." She meant it more thoroughly than the words communicated, and she suspected he knew that because he did the thing where he almost acknowledged it, a slight tilt of the head, and then turned to leave. "Silas," she said. He stopped. The draw knife. The one that belonged to the man who doesn't need it anymore. She wasn't entirely sure why she was saying this. "I've been using it on the loft boards. The repairs. It's a good tool. Whoever made it knew what they were doing." He was quiet for a moment. His back was still toward her. "My father made it," he said. "He died last winter." The weight of that, not just the fact, but the plain way he said it, the way grief becomes factual when you've been carrying it long enough, landed in her chest with a particular familiarity. "I'm sorry," she said. "He'd have wanted it used," Silas said. He didn't turn around. He always said a tool that's not being worked is just metal waiting to rust. Then he was gone, down the path with his mule, and Abigail stood at the west wall of her cabin and pressed her own palm against the logs the way he'd done, feeling forgive, and found none. The hardest week was the third one, and she hadn't anticipated which problem would be the hardest one in it. She'd managed the chimney and the floor and the chinking and the west wall shims and the loft board replacement and the door. She'd finally dealt with the door, spending a full day planning the frame and resetting the hinges so that it hung straight and latched without her having to shoulder it, which had given her a satisfaction out of proportion to the size of the task. Because a door that opened and closed properly was the most basic claim a person could make about the quality of their home, and she had not had it until now. The problem that arrived in the third week was the roof. She noticed it on a Thursday. Not the day of the week, exactly, but she'd been counting days by the waxing of the moon, and it was the fourth night after the new moon when she woke at some hour before dawn to find a thin line of water running across the loft floorboards toward her head. Not a torrent. A line. Maybe a foot wide, moving slow and cold across the wood. She lay there for a moment looking at the water coming at her face and thought, of course. She went up on the roof the next morning and found it. The roof was shakes, split cedar, laid in overlapping courses the way they were supposed to be. But two courses about a third of the way from the ridge had shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the underlapping course was exposed at the joint, and 3 seasons of freeze-thaw had worked the gap open to something water found interesting. She could fix it. She knew she could fix it. But cedar shakes were not something she had, and her coins were gone, and she sat on the ridge of her cabin roof in the thin November cold, and thought very carefully about what she owned that could be traded and what she knew that could be offered and what she was willing to do. Hazel, that evening. What do you need? Cedar shakes. 20 or 30 should cover it. Or I could use split pine if there's no cedar. Pine won't last as long, but it'll get me through the winter. Hazel was quiet for a moment. There's a man named Cord Waverly who has a pile of split cedar behind his barn. He put on a new roof in September. He might have excess. What does he want for things? Labor, usually. Hazel looked at her with those even black eyes. He's 63, and his back isn't what it was. His wife died in the spring. He's been trying to put up a winter woodpile and getting about halfway there every day before he has to stop. Abigail looked at her hands. The comfrey was working. The skin was toughening rather than breaking now, a different texture than what it had been a month ago. Tell him I'll split wood for 2 days, she said, and I need the shakes and enough pitch to seal them. Hazel nodded, as if this were exactly the arrangement she'd been expecting to propose. Cord Waverly's woodpile took 2 days, and most of what she had left in her legs, because he had 3 cords of unsplit rounds stacked in his side yard, and a maul that weighed 8 pounds, and the particular kind of knotty elm that splits into 3 pieces when you want 2 and refuses to split at all when you want 3. But she had spent weeks now doing work that her body had never been asked to do before, and she had found, in those weeks, something she hadn't expected. Her body was capable of more than she'd known. Not because she'd underestimated it. She'd never had the luxury of thinking much about what it could do, only enduring what people said it couldn't. She had simply never had the opportunity to find out. She found out with the elm maul. She found out that she could swing 8 pounds of iron for 6 hours if she kept her breathing steady and her stance low and her grip relaxed. She found out that the weight she carried in her hips and thighs was not, as she'd heard suggested at various points in her life, a failing. It was ballast. It was leverage. It was the difference between a stroke that glanced and a stroke that split. She found out that she could read the grain of a log by looking at the end cut and choose her line before the maul came down and be right, most of the time, in a way that felt less like skill and more like something older than skill. She split 3 cords in 2 days. Her back was a solid wall of protest. Her right shoulder had an ache in it that would likely last a month, but the cedar shakes and the pine pitch were loaded on Hazel's borrowed cart, and when she got them home and went up on the roof, she had them laid and sealed in a single long afternoon. And when the first rain came 3 days later, she lay in her loft in the dark and listened, and the roof was quiet above her, holding. One small thing, then another, then another. That was the month's lesson, she decided. There was no single moment where it got better. There was no day when she woke up and the cabin was done and her life was different. There was only the accumulation of individual things fixed, each one taking more than she expected and giving her less visible reward than she hoped, and the aggregate of all those things was a structure that was slowly, stubbornly becoming a home. But the town of Harwick did not see the accumulation. The town saw the absence. The town saw that Cornelius Turner had put his daughter-in-law out in early November, and she hadn't come back down the ridge, and she hadn't died, as far as anyone could tell. And beyond that, the town had its own concerns. She went down to Harwick twice in November, both times for necessity. Once to the grain mill to barter 2 days of work grinding in exchange for a 50-pound sack of cornmeal, and once to ask about the price of pine tar at the dry goods, which turned out to be beyond what she could arrange, and so she left without it. Both times she walked through town with her burlap sack and her heavy body and her increasingly weathered face, and she felt, with perfect clarity, the quality of people's watching. Some of it was pity. She recognized that. The particular softness that people get around their eyes when they're looking at someone they consider unfortunate. She had seen that look her whole life, aimed at her body before she'd done anything wrong, and she had long since stopped finding it comforting. Some of it was something else. She couldn't name it exactly. A kind of wariness, maybe. like people who had been expecting a thing to happen weren't sure what to make of the thing not happening. On the second trip, coming out of the grain mill with her sack of cornmeal over her shoulder, she passed Sarah Plum sweeping her steps. Sarah Plum was the kind of woman who had strong opinions about what was appropriate and no particular hesitation about expressing them. She had been at the funeral. She had heard Cornelius's remark about the family. She had had, as far as Abigail could tell, an expression of studied neutrality about the whole business. Sarah stopped sweeping when Abigail came by. She looked at the cornmeal sack. She looked at Abigail's hands, the toughened palms, the new calluses, the scar on the left one from the first chimney climb. She looked at Abigail's face, which had lost what small softness it had carried and taken on a different quality, something sharper and more settled. "Still up there on the ridge?" Sarah said. It was not a hostile question, but it was not a warm one. It was the question of someone who has wagered something internally and is checking the outcome. "Yes," Abigail said. "Through the winter? That's the plan." Sarah looked at her for another moment, expressionless. She said, and went back to sweeping. Cornelius Turner was not a man who checked on things he'd discarded. This was his principle and his practice. He had discarded 2 business partners, a lawyer, a hunting dog that had stopped performing, and his dead son's wife. And in each case he had closed the door behind the discarding and not looked back. Because looking back was a behavior he associated with weakness and second-guessing, and he was neither weak nor prone to second-guessing in his own assessment. He heard things, of course. The widow was still on the ridge. The widow had apparently repaired the old Garner cabin and was wintering there. The widow was trading labor for supplies in town. He heard these things the way he heard weather reports, as information about conditions that did not directly concern him. He did not think about her hands. He did not think about what she was eating. He did not think about the cold. He was a man who had trained himself not to think about the consequences of his own decisions once the decisions were made, and he was very good at it. One evening in late November, his foreman, a practical man named Gus, mentioned in passing that the widow Turner had done 3 days of work at the grain mill, and that Red Halsey said she could split wood about as well as any man he'd hired. Cornelius looked at Gus for a moment, and then went back to his supper, and Gus understood that this was not a topic for further development. But something shifted in Cornelius that evening that he didn't notice shifting, the way a wall that is slowly developing a crack doesn't make noise about it. Something moved slightly in the structure of his certainty and settled somewhere it hadn't been before. He didn't examine it. He was not a man who examined his own walls. December came in without ceremony, just a steady drop in temperature that had a different quality from November's cold, drier, more absolute, the kind of cold that made the air feel thin and focused. Abigail woke each morning now to find the water in her clay storage jar had a skin of ice on it that she broke with her knuckles before she could drink. The fire had to be banked just right overnight, too small, and the room fell to dangerous temperatures by morning, too large and it burned through her wood stores too fast. Wood was the constant pressure. Wood was always the pressure. She had to have enough to burn, and enough daylight to cut it, and enough strength to do both, and the mathematics of that equation were never quite comfortable. She developed a system, 2 hours of woodcutting in the morning before the light was fully up, which took advantage of the cold to make the work feel more urgent and therefore faster. Then work on the cabin through the midday hours when her body was warmest. Then stack and cover the new wood in the late afternoon before dark came. Sleep. Repeat. Her body was changing in a way she noticed by its absence of its old patterns. The deep ache she'd carried in her knees for years, a thing she'd attributed to her weight and had largely stopped noticing because it was so constant. That ache had changed its character. It was sharper after long days, but it recovered faster, and the mornings that had used to start with her knees stiff and resistant were now mostly just cold. Her back was a different story. The new aches specific and rotational in ways she was learning to read as muscle rather than bone, which meant they were a complaint she'd earned rather than a condition she was enduring. She thought about this distinction sometimes when she was splitting wood, the difference between pain that means you're breaking down and pain that means you're being built up. She wasn't sure the two kinds always felt different from the inside, but she was learning to interrogate her body the way she interrogated her tools, asking not just does it hurt, but where exactly, and what direction, and what does that mean? Hazel had opinions about this. Hazel had opinions about most things, delivered in the same dry declarative style, and her opinions about the body were listen to it when it's trying to tell you something structural, ignore it when it's just tired. The problem, she acknowledged, was that distinguishing between the two required experience that you could only get by getting it wrong a few times. Abigail was accumulating that experience. It was Silas who noticed the foundation. He'd come up twice more since the shim work on the west wall, once with an extra maul head that he said was sitting useless on his scrap pile, once with a question from Hazel about whether Abigail had the materials she needed for the window frames, which was his mother's way of arriving at something she wanted to help with, while preserving the fiction that she wasn't managing the situation. Both times he'd looked at the cabin with those careful eyes, making his silent assessments and occasionally saying something that was technically an observation, but functioned as instruction. On the second December visit, he walked the perimeter of the cabin with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at where the log walls met the ground. He stopped at the southeast corner and crouched down and brushed away the frost-killed grass at the base of the foundation stones. He looked at what was there for a long moment. "Come here," he said. She came. She crouched beside him and looked where he was looking. The foundation stone at the corner, a large flat granite, had settled. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but it had moved down on the east side, maybe half an inch, and the log sill resting on it had followed it, and the wall above was reacting, a slight inward lean that was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, but which Silas Boone had apparently been looking for. "How bad?" she said. "Not bad yet." He pressed his palm against the log sill and pushed. It didn't move, but it had less resistance than the rest of the wall. "If you let it go another winter without addressing it, you'll have a bad lean by spring. After 2 winters, the corner starts to pull away from the wall." She looked at the ground around the foundation stone. She could see, now that she was looking, what had happened. The soil on the east side of the stone was softer than the west, either from water drainage or soil composition, and the stone had slowly followed gravity. "What do I need?" "2 things." He stood up. "Something solid under the east side of that stone, ideally another flat stone, something with good compressive strength, packed in dry, and you need to address the drainage so water's not softening the soil in that corner. Run a French drain if you can." She looked at him. "A French drain? You know what that is?" "I know what it is," she said. "I've never made one." I was quiet for a moment, looking at the corner. Then, "I have some flat field stone at the smithy that I was going to use for something else. I can bring it next time I come up." He paused. "The drain I can show you. It's not complicated if the ground's not frozen yet." "The ground's still soft a few inches down," she said. "The frost's only about 2 inches this week." He nodded. "Saturday," he said, and walked back to his mule. She stood at the southeast corner of her cabin after he'd gone and looked at that half-inch settlement in the foundation stone, and she thought about how close she'd come to not seeing it, how easy it would have been to miss, and how the missing of it would have cost her the wall, which would have cost her the cabin, which would have cost her everything. She thought about the fact that Silas Boone, a man who was careful about where he spent his attention, had walked the perimeter of her cabin looking for exactly this kind of thing, without being asked. She thought about his father's draw knife in her loft, still the finest tool she owned. She thought about all the ways that help arrived when it didn't look like help at all, arrived looking like a dry observation, a practical suggestion, a quiet walk around a foundation in December. Saturday. Silas came with the flat field stone and a spade, and he showed her how to cut a shallow trench angled away from the foundation corner, and how to fill it with the flat stones laid edge to edge so water could travel along them and away from the building instead of sitting and soaking. She dug while he directed, which was how it worked. He talked through the logic, and she did the physical labor, not because he was above it, but because it was her cabin and she needed to understand the doing, not just the outcome. He seemed to understand this without being told. He'd position the stones and show her the angle and then step back and let her repeat it, correcting when she got it wrong. "Too steep," he said when she cut the trench at too sharp an angle. "Water doesn't need to rush. It needs to move. If the angle's too steep, it erodes the base and you're back where you started." She flattened the grade. He looked at it. "Better." They worked for 3 hours. At some point, Hazel appeared with bread and dried venison, set it on the porch, said nothing, and disappeared back up the ridge. They ate standing because neither of them had suggested sitting down, and the bread was good. Hazel's bread was always good, made with something in it that gave it a dense, particular flavor that Abigail had been trying to identify for weeks without success. "What does your mother put in the bread?" she asked. Silas looked at his piece of bread as though the question had surprised him. "Caraway," he said, "and something else. I've never been able to figure out the something else. I thought maybe it was rosemary. I thought fennel seed. She won't tell you if you ask." "I asked," Abigail said. "She said it was none of my concern." Something moved in Silas's face. Not a smile exactly. Something more reluctant than a smile. A thing that started to become a smile, and then thought better of it, but left a trace. "She said the same thing to my wife," he said. "Martha asked her every time we had dinner at the house." He paused. "She never found out either." The bread sat between them. Abigail looked at the drainage trench they'd dug and thought about Martha Boone, whoever she'd been, failing to extract a bread recipe from the most determinedly private woman on the northern ridge, and thought about how that detail was specific enough to be real, in a way that most things weren't. "She sounds like she was stubborn," Abigail said. "Relentlessly," Silas said. "More than me, even. Which is saying something." He set down the bread and went back to setting the last section of drain stone. "She would have come up and helped you herself," he said, to the ground rather than to Abigail. "That first week. She wouldn't have sent tools. She would have come up and just started working." Abigail didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be inadequate. They finished the drain in the late afternoon. The foundation stone needed to wait for a full thaw before they could properly address it. Pulling it and resetting it with packed gravel below was better done when the ground was soft. For now, the drain would manage the water and slow the settling. Silas packed his spade and looked at the corner one more time. "Spring," he said. "We'll reset that stone properly in spring." She noted the "we," but didn't mark it aloud. "Thank you," she said, "for the stone and the drain and for the draw knife. Your father's work. I think about it when I use it." He was quiet. He picked up his spade and his coat and walked to his mule and untied it and stood there for a moment with his hand on the animal's neck. He'd have liked knowing it was on a job, he said at last. He always said a well-made tool was only finished when someone was using it. He rode her down the path. The last light was coming through the trees at a low angle and catching the frost on the cabin logs and turning them briefly gold. And Abigail stood in her yard and watched him go and thought about all the things that were made to be used, tools and strength and people, and how the worst thing you could do to any of them was put them somewhere safe and forget about them. She looked at the cabin, the chimney she'd rebuilt, the floor she'd leveled, the walls she'd rechinked, and the roof she'd relaid, and the door that now opened and closed like it meant it, and the drain along the southeast corner keeping the water honest. The hardest winter on record, the people of Harwick said, was coming. She'd heard it at the grain mill. The old-timers were saying the signs were all there, the thickness of the squirrel coats, the early departure of the geese, the quality of the ice forming on the lower creek. She was not afraid of it. Not because she was brave. She was afraid of plenty of things. She'd learned that much about herself in the past 6 weeks. But because she had looked at every problem this cabin had thrown at her, and she had dealt with it, one thing at a time, badly at first and better as she went. And she had built something out of the dealing that she didn't have a word for yet. She went inside. She fed the fire. She got out her mother's bone-handled knife and sharpened it on the whetstone Hazel had given her, slow, careful strokes, the same angle each time, listening to the sound of it change as the edge came back. Outside, the temperature dropped another degree. And another. And the winter that was coming gathered itself on the ridge above her and prepared, patient as stone, to test everything she'd built. She sharpened the knife and did not think about Cornelius Turner. She thought about the southeast corner and the drain and spring and what she would do when the ground was soft enough to reset that foundation stone and put it right, and how that would be one more thing done. One more thing at a time, that was all. That was enough. The storm didn't announce itself the way the smaller ones had. The smaller storms had come in with a kind of bluster, wind picking up through the afternoon, clouds stacking on the northwestern horizon in visible layers so that you had 4 or 5 hours of warning if you were paying attention. Abigail had learned to read them. Hazel had taught her, partly through direct instruction and partly through the habit of making observations out loud that Abigail had learned to store and cross-reference. When the wind shifts southeast before noon and comes back northwest by 3, you'll have snow by dark. Or, the way that cloud formation sits flat on the bottom means it's moving fast. Fast storms are usually light. She'd been cataloging these observations the way she cataloged everything now, as survival data. This storm was different. It came on a Tuesday in the second week of January, and it announced itself not with wind or clouds, but with silence. She noticed it first thing in the morning, the absence of the usual ambient noise of the ridge, the small sounds of birds, and the distant creak of trees settling in the cold. There was nothing. The air outside had a quality she'd never felt before, a kind of held breath pressure, as though the atmosphere itself was making room for something. She went to Hazel's before breakfast. The old woman was already outside, standing in her yard looking north. She didn't turn when Abigail came up the path, just kept looking at the sky over the ridge. "How bad?" Abigail said. Hazel was quiet for a moment. "My father talked about a storm like this. Said he saw one when he was about 12. Said he saw one when he was about 12. She finally looked at Abigail, and what was in those black eyes was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the specific gravity of someone who is calculating against a variable they don't fully know. He said it took 3 days to blow through, and when it was done, there was nothing left standing that hadn't been built right. Abigail looked at the northern sky. It was a peculiar color, not the gray of ordinary storm clouds, but something flatter, more uniform, like the sky had simply stopped being sky and become a ceiling. "How much time do we have?" she said. "Maybe 6 hours, maybe less." Hazel turned back to her cabin. "I'm going to bank my fire and bring in everything that's outside. You should do the same." Abigail was already turning back down the path. "What about the people in town?" Hazel said something that Abigail half heard over the sound of her own footsteps accelerating, something about how the people in town had their own preparations and their own problems. But Abigail was already moving at a pace that was not quite a run, but was everything her leg would allow after the December bruise that had never entirely resolved. She spent the next 5 hours doing what she could. She brought in every piece of split wood that was stacked outside, carrying armload after armload until the cabin floor had a wall of wood 2 feet deep along the north wall. She checked the chimney cap, solid, the clay mortar from November having cured through 4 months into something she'd have to work to chip off. She checked the loft boards, all solid, the repairs holding. She checked the door, latched properly, the rehung hinges still true. She checked the west wall shims, Silas's iron plates still seated where he'd driven them, the drainage trench along the southeast corner still clear. Then she sat down and ate. Everything she had that needed cooking, because she didn't know how long the fire would have to be managed carefully, and a hot meal now was more useful than the same food cold in 2 days. Cornmeal porridge with the last of the dried venison crumbled into it, and the heel of bread she'd been rationing, and the rest of the dried apple that Hazel had given her 2 weeks ago. She ate slowly. The silence outside was complete. The storm hit at 4 in the afternoon, not gradually. It hit the way a wall hits when it falls, all at once, without intermediate steps. The wind came first, and it was not the wind she'd experienced before, not the pushy, aggressive wind of ordinary blizzards, but something deeper and more absolute, a wind that felt structural, like it was the weather's skeleton rather than its surface. The cabin shuddered, not violently, not in a way that felt like it would fail, but with the particular shudder of something that is being seriously tested for the first time. She sat by the fire and listened to the cabin. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving a severe storm in a structure you'd built yourself. You spent the whole thing listening. Every creak and groan and shift had a meaning she'd learned over 3 months of living inside these walls, and she was cataloging them now in real time. That's the north wall reacting to wind pressure. That's normal. That's the loft beam settling. That's fine. That was new. Something in the roof, upper right corner of the loft. A sound like a drawn breath, repeated every few seconds in sync with the heaviest wind gusts. She was up the loft ladder in seconds, and she put her ear to the cedar shakes in the corner and listened and felt, with her palm flat, and identified it. One shake in the upper course had worked itself slightly loose. Not dangerously loose. It wasn't lifting, just flexing. But if the wind found the right angle, it would peel it back, and then she'd have a hole in her roof in the middle of the worst storm in living memory. She needed to nail it. She had nails, a coffee tin of them she'd accumulated through trades and fines. She had her hammer. What she did not have was a way to get to the outside of the roof in a blizzard with wind that was currently trying to rearrange the landscape. She lay flat on the loft floor and thought about this problem with the particular clarity that comes from having very limited options and very limited time. She could access the upper roof course from the interior if she could get above the shake, which meant she needed to work through the loft ceiling, which was also the roof deck. She had the hand auger Silas had left. She could bore a small hole at the right position, work a piece of iron wire through it, thread the wire under the loose shake from inside, and pull it tight and anchor it to the rafter. It took her an hour and 20 minutes in the dark of the loft with the wind screaming outside and the cabin shaking in steady, considered pulses. She bored 3 holes, the first 2 wrong, the third right. She burned her fingers twice on the lantern she'd wedged between 2 loft boards to see by. She dropped the wire and had to find it by feel in the dark 3 times. When it was done, the repair was ugly and it would need proper replacement in the spring, and she didn't care at all because the shake was seated and the roof above her was sealed and the storm could do what it wanted. She came down from the loft at some hour she couldn't determine, dark outside, dark inside except the fire, and sat on the floor and looked at her hands in the firelight. The burn marks on 2 fingers, the wire cuts on the others, the permanent calluses that were just part of her hands now. She thought, I know this cabin, I know every part of it. I know what it sounds like when it's afraid and what it sounds like when it's fine, and I know the difference. That knowledge felt important in a way she hadn't fully articulated before. Not pride exactly, but ownership of a deeper kind than the deed in her coat pocket. She owned it because she'd made it. She owned it with her hands and her time and the things she'd learned by getting them wrong first. The fire was solid. The chimney drew. The walls were quiet. She slept. She woke to knocking. Hard, urgent, the kind of knocking that has been going on for a while before it wakes you. She was up and at the door before she was entirely conscious, her hand on the latch. And when she pulled it open, the cold that came in was a physical thing, a mass, something with weight. There were 3 people on her porch. A man she recognized vaguely from the grain mill. Cord Waverley's neighbor, she thought, name of Beach or Beach. And a woman holding a child of maybe 5. And behind them in the dark and the driving snow, shapes that she couldn't immediately count. Please, the man said. His face was ice-burned, the exposed skin around his eyes red and raw and damaged looking. Please. The Cooper building came down. North wall it came down. We have children, Come in, she said. He kept talking, some explanation or justification she didn't need. Come in, she said again, and stepped aside, and they came. There were 7 of them. The man, his name was Beach, she confirmed it when he told her, and his wife Ruth and their daughter Clara, and Ruth's mother, who was very old and moving carefully on feet she couldn't feel, and 3 others she didn't know at all. A young man not more than 18 with a broken-looking arm held against his chest, a woman of middle age named Dorothea who had blood on her temple from something she kept saying was nothing, and a boy of about 9 who was not crying but whose silence had the quality of shock. She got the old woman, Ruth's mother, her name was May, to the fire first and got her hands and feet close to the heat with the specific instruction not to get too close too fast, which Hazel had taught her about cold-damaged extremities. She got Clara the blanket from the loft. She got the young man with the broken arm, Joseph, he said, his voice high and tight with pain, situated against the wall with his arm as still as she could make it, padded with her folded coat. Who else is out there? She said to Beach. He was still shaking. Not from cold, from something deeper than cold. The Cooper building had maybe 15 people sheltering. Not everyone got out before the north wall. He stopped, swallowed. I don't know who else got out. There were other buildings. People were going to the Turner store, to the mill. I don't know. How far did you come? 3 miles. Maybe 3.5. In that, he gestured at the door behind him, at the world of wind and white beyond it. 3.5 miles in that storm. She looked at the raw skin around his eyes and thought about what that had cost him and his family and understood that it had cost more than she could see. You're safe now, she said. This cabin will hold. He looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has just survived something and is not yet certain whether surviving was the right word for what happened. How do you know? He said. Because I built it, she said. Sit down. He sat down. Well, they came in waves after that, in groups of 2 and 3, and once a group of 6, staggering up the path through the dark and the wind and knocking on her door with whatever they had left. She opened the door each time, and each time the cold came with them, and she shut it again and made room. By what she estimated was midnight, there were 23 people in a cabin that was 12 feet by 14. 23 people. She did the arithmetic automatically, the way she'd learned to do arithmetic about wood and food and heat. 23 bodies generated warmth, which helped. 23 bodies consumed air, which was a consideration. 23 bodies needed water and food, which was the most pressing immediate problem. She had cornmeal. She had about 40 pounds of it left from the last mill trade, which was more than she'd have had if she hadn't been rationing. She had dried venison, enough for a few meals if she stretched it. She had the dried apples, which were nearly gone. She had a large clay pot and a smaller one and the fire. She made porridge. There was nothing else to call it. Cornmeal and water and the venison broken up fine into it, cooked until it was thick, served in whatever vessels people had, or in the 2 wooden bowls she owned passed from person to person. It was not enough. It was something, which was not the same as enough, but was the only category available. The 9-year-old boy, she'd found out his name was Thomas, had not spoken since he'd arrived. He sat near the fire with his knees pulled up and his arms around them and his eyes moving over the faces in the room in a slow circuit that never settled. She brought him a bowl of porridge and crouched down to his level and put it in his hands. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her. "You did a hard thing tonight," she said, "coming through that storm." He didn't say anything. "Can you eat?" she said. He looked at the bowl. He picked up the spoon. She'd given him the better of her 2 spoons, the wooden one that she'd shaped herself. And he ate. Not enthusiastically, but steadily, which was enough. She stood up and looked at the room. 23 people in the warmth of a cabin that 2 months ago had been a ruin, that real estate men described as a death trap, and that neighbors had expected to serve as her grave. The fire was drawing. The chimney she'd rebuilt from collapsed stone was handling a load it had never been designed for, and doing it without complaint. The walls she'd rechinked were sealed. The roof she'd relaid was holding. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the cabin held.
But Josie...
Ruth came and stood beside her after a while. Ruth was a practical woman in her 30s who had, since arriving, taken on the task of organizing the people in the cabin with an efficiency that suggested she managed large groups regularly. She'd gotten the children into the warmest corner near the fire. She'd gotten the injured young man, Joseph, a proper splint improvised from 2 flat pieces of wood from Abigail's scrap pile, which she'd seen Dorothea, who turned out to be a midwife with general medical experience, apply with strips torn from a shirt. "How long can we stay?" Ruth asked. Not as a demand, as a practical question from one practical person to another. "As long as you need to," Abigail said. Ruth looked at her. Something passed across her face, a recalibration of some kind. "I know who you are," she said. "You're the woman Cornelius Turner put out in November." "I am." Ruth looked around the room, at the solid walls, the drawing chimney, the warm interior of a cabin that had no business being as sound as it was. "He put you out in November and you built this," she said. "Mostly fixed," Abigail said. "It was here before me. I just convinced it to stay." Ruth made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "There are people in town who are going to have a lot to think about when this storm is done," she said. Abigail didn't respond to that. She went to check on May, whose feet were pinking up cautiously, and on Joseph, whose arm was splinted and who had stopped making the high-tight sounds of acute pain and moved into the lower register of something more endurable. He arrived at the door at some hour she estimated was between 2 and 3 in the morning. She knew his knock. She recognized it the same way she'd recognized his voice on the morning he'd thrown her out, not from any particular quality of sound, but from the certainty with which it landed, the knock of a man who had spent 60 years believing that his knock on a door was a statement rather than a request. She stood with her hand on the latch for a moment. 23 people behind her, sleeping or talking quietly or tending to the injured, the fire steady, the cabin holding. She opened the door. Cornelius Turner stood on her porch. He was without his coat. She registered that immediately, the absence of it in the driving cold, the way his shirt was crusted with snow and ice along the shoulders and collar. He was alone. His face, which she had last seen performing the expression of a man disposing of something inconvenient, now held something she hadn't seen on it before. Not humility exactly, because she suspected humility was not in his working vocabulary, but something like the state a person arrives at when humility has been imposed on them by circumstances large enough that argument became beside the point. His eyes went past her to the interior of the cabin, to the fire, to the people. He looked at her. My store's roof caved, he said. His voice was flat still, but with a different flatness. Not the flatness of contempt, but the flatness of a man who has used up all his other registers, and this is what's left. There are people trapped. 2 of them are children. She held the door open and felt the cold pouring in around him. Behind her, she heard the room shift, people waking to the draft, and the change in light, and she heard Ruth's voice saying something quiet to someone. She looked at Cornelius Turner. 60-something years old, standing coatless in a January blizzard on the porch of the cabin she'd bought with 5 silver coins after he'd thrown her into the cold with a burlap sack and 3 days of grief. His breath came in white clouds. His lips were the wrong color. She thought about this morning he'd cracked the bedroom door open and the word sundown, and the way his eyes had moved over her body with the particular contempt of a man who had already decided what she was worth. She thought about what she was going to do. Who else is trapped? She said. He blinked. He hadn't expected the question. He'd expected, she supposed, something else. She wasn't sure what. Recrimination. Refusal. The symmetry of being turned away at a door. 2 children, an older man named Gus. He works for me, and he stopped. How many total? Maybe 4 or 5? The center beam failed and brought the roof section down into the back room. That's where most of them were sheltering. He paused. The front section is standing. I came out through the front. She was already thinking about the structural problem. A partial roof collapse with people in the back section. The immediate danger was the rest of the roof coming down, which in this wind and under this snow load was not hypothetical. The secondary danger was cold exposure and injury from the collapse itself. She needed to know the geometry of the failure before she could know what was possible. How far is the store from here? 3 miles down the ridge. She looked at him for one more moment. She was aware that this moment had a shape that the rest of her life would refer back to, that she was at a door and someone was on the wrong side of it, and the power in this particular transaction, for once, was hers. She stepped back from the door. Come in and get warm, she said. 2 minutes. Tell me everything about how the building sits and where the beam was and what you could see of the failure. Then we figure out how to get them out. He came inside. He said nothing more, and she didn't expect him to, didn't need him to. She got him close to the fire and she made him describe the building with the methodical attention of someone extracting structural information, asking about the beam span and the roof pitch, and where the collapse had originated, and what the back room's walls were like, and whether there were windows. She drew it in her head as he talked, a rough map, imprecise, but enough to work with. Beach was awake and listening. He'd been in the Turner store before. He added details. The east window had a wide sill, ground level, could be accessed from outside. The back wall was full log construction, not frame, which meant it was load-bearing and stable even if the roof had failed above it. The east window, Abigail said. If the roof section came down in the center, the east wall might still be clear. It might be, Beach said. She looked around the room. Dorothea the midwife was awake, watching her with the focused attention of someone assessing a situation they might need to participate in. Ruth was awake. Joseph was awake, but his arm was still splinted and he was out of the physical question. Young Thomas was awake, watching her with those 2 old eyes. I need someone who can move fast in the snow and knows the town layout, she said. And I need rope. I know the town, Beach said. He was already standing up. And I can move. She had rope. The braided rawhide coil Hazel had given her in November, which she'd extended over the months with additional length from various sources. She had her coat. She had her mother's bone-handled knife. She looked at Cornelius Turner, who was sitting by the fire with his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging between them. The posture of a man who has been emptied out by something larger than his self-conception. When we come back, we'll have more people, she said to Ruth. Keep the fire going and make room. Ruth nodded once. It was a complete transaction between 2 women who understood the situation without needing to discuss it. Going down the ridge in that storm was the hardest physical thing she had ever done. She knew this objectively while she was doing it, cataloging it in the part of her mind that had become, over 3 months of frontier winter, a continuous running assessment of conditions and tolerances and risks. The wind was a constant lateral force that had to be accounted for with every step. You leaned into it not by instinct but by calculation, adjusting your body angle to maintain forward progress without being knocked sideways into the trees. The snow on the path was 2 feet of hard-packed base, with another 8 to 10 inches of new powder on top, and underneath the powder were the drifts and ridges of earlier freezes that made the footing treacherous. She went down steadily, not fast. Beach ahead of her because he had longer legs and the lead position broke the worst of the wind for her, and behind her she was aware of Cornelius Turner following at a pace that surprised her. She had expected him to struggle more and he didn't, which told her that whatever else he was not a physically soft man. She didn't think about him. She thought about the east window and the roof beam and the geometry of the failure and what she would find when she got there. They reached town in 40 minutes, which was fast enough that she arrived with something still in reserve. Not comfortable reserve, not significant reserve, but enough. The town was unrecognizable. Wind had driven the snow into configurations that turned familiar landmarks into abstractions, and the sounds that were normally the sounds of a settlement, the small mechanical and human noise of people living in proximity, were all gone, replaced by the singular enormous sound of the storm. The Turner store sat at the north end of the main street, and even through the dark and the snow she could see the wrongness of its roofline from half a block away. The center section had come down, not entirely, not a flat collapse, but a V shape, the middle driven in while the two ends held their height. Smoke and firelight visible through the front window, which told her the front section was intact and heated. The back section was dark. She went around to the east side. The east window was there, at ground level, and the snow drifted against the wall below. It was deep, but the window itself was clear. The east wall was still standing. The roof failure hadn't pulled it. She dug at the snow below the window with her hands, and Beach joined her, and they cleared enough to get to the window frame. She knocked on the glass. Once, twice, and then a voice from inside, a child's voice, she thought, and then a shape at the window, a face pressing against the glass. A young girl, maybe 7, her breath fogging the pain. "Can you open it from inside?" Abigail called. The girl shook her head. Abigail looked at the frame, latched from inside, but the latch was a simple hook and eye. She took her knife and slid it between the frame and the sill, found the eye, lifted it, and the window swung outward. Cold and smoke came out together, and then the girl's hands on the sill, reaching. Abigail lifted her through. She was not a small girl, but Abigail's arms were what they were now, and the girl came through the window and into the cold and started crying immediately, which was correct, which was the right response to the situation, and Abigail held her against her chest for exactly the time it took to confirm that she was physically intact, then passed her to Beach. She went through the window herself. It was a tight fit. She knew it would be, and she went in sideways, pulling herself through with her arms, and the window frame caught her hips. And for 3 seconds she was stuck with half her body inside and half out, and the wind on her back and the smoke in her face, and the specific horror of a stuck person who has no time to be stuck. She exhaled, completely, all the way, and pulled with everything her arms had, and she came through. Inside. Dark, smoke, the sound of the collapsed roof section, which was not entirely silent. There were creaks and settling sounds, the vocabulary of a structure that had failed and was still figuring out where its new equilibrium was. She did not find this comforting. "Hello," she called into the dark. "Hello." A sound. From further back toward the collapsed section. An adult voice, male, careful. "Here. We're here. Don't come further back. The ceiling's not stable." She stopped. She let her eyes adjust to the dark. She could see, in the dim light from the window behind her, the rough outline of the room. Barrels, shelving, goods stacked against the walls. And the far wall, partially visible, which had a man-shaped thing crouched against it. And below him, on the floor, 2 more shapes. "How many?" she called. 4. "Gus has a bad leg. Eliza can walk. The boy can walk." A pause. "Margaret is... she's cold. She's been still for a while." She didn't let herself respond to still for a while in the way her body wanted to respond to it. "Can you make it to the window?" she called. "Along the walls. Stay against the walls. Away from the center." "Yes," the man said. "The children first?" "Children first." It took 20 minutes. The children came first. Eliza, who had found Abigail at the window and crossed without guidance, quick and sure. The boy, who was slower and made a sound she didn't want to analyze when he passed under the unstable ceiling section in the center of the room, but who made it. The man, whose name she learned was Warren, came next, helping Gus, who had a leg that didn't work and who moved in a controlled fall from handhold to handhold along the wall. And last, Warren went back for Margaret. Margaret was 11 years old and she had been unconscious for she didn't know how long, and her skin, when Abigail put her hands to her face through the window, was the wrong temperature. Not the worst temperature, not the irreversible temperature, but wrong in a way that required immediate action. She was back through that window in 3 minutes with the rope tied under Margaret's arms and Beach and Cornelius on the other end hauling, and she came through the window, supported between the rope and Abigail's arms, and Abigail felt the window frame take her hips again, and this time she didn't fight it, just waded through it, because Margaret was what mattered, and Margaret was coming through. They got her. 6 people out of a collapsed building in a blizzard in the middle of the night. Going back up the ridge was longer. It was always longer going back, when the thing you'd gone for was now a body you were responsible for. Cornelius Turner carried Margaret for most of the way up, which Abigail registered without comment. He was 60-something years old and had been out in the storm for hours, and he carried the girl without stopping, which was either stubbornness or something else, and she didn't have the processing capacity to decide which. They arrived back at the cabin at what she estimated was 4 in the morning. Ruth met them at the door. Ruth took Margaret from Cornelius's arms without being asked and had her by the fire and was doing what needed to be done in the specific, efficient way of a woman who does not need to be told what needs doing. Abigail stood in her doorway and looked at her cabin. 29 people now, counting the ones they'd brought back. Her 12-foot by 14-foot cabin, rebuilt from ruin with her own clay and her own wire and her own destroyed hands, holding 29 people in the worst storm in living memory. Cornelius Turner came in behind her and she moved aside to let him in, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the interior of the cabin, the fire, the people, the walls, the clean-drawing chimney, and something in his face went through several things very quickly. She watched it happen without feeling triumphant, which surprised her. She had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired and functional and very clear. He turned to look at her. The expression on his face was one she had never seen on it before and probably would not see again. The expression of a man who is being shown something about the nature of his own errors in the most concrete possible terms, by the person those errors were committed against. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just flatly, the way you'd say don't to a cup that was near the edge of a table. "Not tonight. Sit down. Get warm." He sat down. "Asiki." The storm ran for 2.5 days. In those 2.5 days, Abigail's cabin became several things simultaneously: a shelter, a medical station, a kitchen producing continuous quantities of porridge, and eventually a thin soup. When Hazel appeared on the second morning with dried beans and the information that her own cabin had 6 people in it, and could she borrow Abigail's larger pot, it became a place where children slept in the loft in an arrangement that Abigail could not have engineered, but that Ruth managed with a confidence that suggested she'd been managing children in small spaces for years. It became, and this was the thing that Abigail noticed with a quiet, private astonishment, a warm place. Not just in temperature, though the chimney held and the fire burned and the walls kept what was built inside, but in the human sense of the word. People talked. People helped each other. Dorothy attended to Joseph's arm and May's frost-threatened feet, and Margaret, who regained consciousness on the second morning and ate soup and said her head hurt and was otherwise intact. Silas Boone arrived on the second day, coming down from Hazel's cabin with more dried beans and the stoic competence of a man who had simply added this situation to his list of things to address. He looked at the cabin, at the working chimney and the sealed walls and the drain he'd helped dig along the southeast corner, which was currently diverting meltwater away from the foundation exactly as designed. And he said nothing, but his eyes, when they found Abigail's, had in them the same thing that had almost been a smile once before. More of it this time. "Foundation's holding?" he said. "Solid," she said. He nodded. "Good." He went inside and began reorganizing the wood stack so that the cabin's airflow wasn't being blocked by it, because even in a crisis, he was incapable of seeing an inefficiency without addressing it, which was either a virtue or a compulsion, and probably both. Cornelius Turner spent the 2.5 days doing something that Abigail watched from the periphery of her attention, being useful. Not in any way he announced or drew attention to. He simply did what needed doing. He hauled water. He kept the fire fed on her rotation so she could sleep. He sat with Gus, whose leg turned out to be broken below the knee, and talked to him in low tones through the bad hours of the night when pain is loudest. He played some kind of word game with Thomas, the 9-year-old boy whose silence had finally cracked on the second day into a careful, watchful participation in the life of the cabin. She didn't know what to make of him, and she didn't try. What she knew was simpler than that. The cabin held. The chimney drew. The walls kept the cold outside and the warmth inside. The roof she'd relayed with cedar shakes traded over 2 days of splitting. Elm did not admit a single drop of snowmelt. The southeast corner drain ran clear. The west wall shims held. On the third morning, the wind dropped. Not all at once. It came down in stages, the way a fever breaks, the top edge of the roar diminishing, and then the middle register, and then the low undertone, until what was left was just the ordinary quiet cold of a January morning after a great storm. People went to the window and looked out. The snow was extraordinary. 4 feet in the yard, 6 against the north side of the cabin, drifted higher than Abigail's head in the hollows between trees. The sky above it was the particular blue that only exists after a major storm, the air scrubbed to a clarity that made everything look sharp-edged and slightly unreal. Abigail stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked at it. She heard people beginning to move behind her, the sound of 29 people starting to figure out what came next, and she heard Ruth's voice organizing it already, and Silas and Beach talking about the best route down to town to assess the damage, and Dorothea telling someone how to wrap May's feet for the walk. She stood in her doorway and looked at the white world. 3 months ago, she had stood in a different doorway, on the other side of it, with a burlap sack and 5 silver coins, and a man behind her who had decided exactly what she was worth. She thought about what those 3 months had cost her. The blisters and the bruises and the burned fingers and the shin that still ached in certain cold and the sleep she'd lost and the weight she'd lost and the weight she'd found, different weight, muscle, and purpose, and the particular density of a person who has been tested past their known limits and found more on the other side. She thought about 29 people sleeping in her cabin, in the cabin she'd built, on the warmth she'd made. She thought about Cornelius Turner hauling water and playing word games with a frightened boy. She stepped off her porch into the snow, which came up to her thighs, and she looked at the northern ridge above her and at the blue sky and at the white field of the world after the storm. One thing at a time, she had said to herself in November, in the dark, by a fire she'd built in a chimney she'd rebuilt, eating soup from a jar an old woman had brought down a path in the night. One thing at a time. The storm was done. The cabin stood. 29 people were alive inside it. That was enough for right now. That was more than enough. And what came after that? What the world was going to look like when they all walked back down into the town that had watched her walk out of it 3 months ago. That was a question for the next hour, the next day, the thing that came after surviving. She stood in the snow and breathed the clean, cold air, and felt for the first time since she had set the pillow down on a bed that wasn't hers and picked up a burlap sack, something that was not adjacent to something else but was the thing itself. She felt simply and without complication that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They walked down the ridge in a long, loose group, 20-some people moving through 4 feet of snow in the particular silence of people who have survived something together and haven't yet figured out what to say about it. Abigail went last. She wanted to see the cabin one more time before she left it, not because she was leaving permanently, she would be back before dark, but because something in her needed to look at it from the outside, the way a person looks at something they've made and are still surprised by. The chimney, the relayed roof, the walls she'd rechinked and the door that hung true, and the southeast corner where the drain ran clean under the snow. 3 months of work standing in 4 feet of January white, looking exactly like what it was, a cabin that had held. She turned and followed the others down. Harwick, when they reached it, was a different town than the one she'd left 3 months ago, and also a different town than the one these people had left 3 nights ago. The storm had rearranged it. 3 buildings had partial or full roof failures, the Turner store being the most significant. Its center section collapsed in the V shape she'd seen in the dark and the wind, looking different in daylight, more permanent. The old feed barn on the south end had lost its entire east wall. A frame house on the mill road had simply fallen, folded in on itself like a letter being put away. People were already outside when they came down, the ones who had sheltered in the church and the mill and the handful of sturdier homes coming out to look at what the storm had left. The silence when Abigail's group emerged from the ridge trail was a particular kind of silence, the kind that happens when people see something that requires them to update an assumption they hadn't known they were making. Ruth Beach walked beside Abigail, which was not accidental. Ruth was the kind of woman who understood the social weight of positioning. She walked beside Abigail through the main street and she talked in a normal voice about what needed to be done, who needed medical attention, what structures needed immediate assessment before anyone went back inside them, what the food situation would be for the people who'd lost their homes. And by talking to Abigail in that normal voice about those normal things, she was making a statement that required no announcement. Sarah Plum was on her steps. She looked at the group coming down the street. Her eyes found Abigail and stayed there. Abigail met her eyes and kept walking. The first thing that needed to happen was structural assessment of the damaged buildings, and this became, without any formal discussion or appointment, Abigail's problem to solve. It happened the way things happened in a small community after a disaster. Someone needed to make a decision, and the person most visibly qualified to make it stepped forward, and everyone else adjusted their reality to accommodate that new fact. Beach had been telling people, on the walk down, about the east window extraction, about Abigail's assessment of the building's geometry, the rope and the knife and the window latch, the order of extraction that had gotten 6 people out before the center section shifted further. He told it in the plain, factual way of someone who had been present and was simply describing what happened, and the people who heard him listened with the attention of people calibrating a revised understanding. So when Warren, the man who'd been inside the Turner store, stood outside his own house, a frame building that had survived the storm but was now listing noticeably at the northeast corner, and said to nobody in particular, "I don't know if it's safe to go back in," it was Abigail he looked at when he said it. She walked around this building. She took her time. She pressed her palm against the corner post and felt forgive. She looked at where the sill plate met the foundation stone and checked the gap. She looked at the roof line for sag and at the east wall for the particular lean that meant the diagonal bracing had failed. She crouched down and looked at the foundation stones at all 4 corners. "The northeast corner stone has shifted," she said. "Same thing mine did. Water under it. Your foundation's only moved about an inch, but the post above it is carrying the load funny now." She stood up. "The building's not going to fall today, but you can't leave it until spring. If another freeze-thaw cycle hits that corner before you address it, you'll have a real problem." She paused. "You need to shore up the post temporarily and deal with the foundation stone when the ground thaws." Warren looked at her. He had the careful expression of a man who is taking in information that is costing him something to take in, not because the information was wrong, but because of who it was coming from. "How do you shore the post?" he asked. She told him. A pair of angled braces cut from green timber, set at 45 degrees to the post from the ground, nailed at the top and pegged at the bottom. Not a permanent fix. A winter fix, a thing to buy time until the ground was workable. She described it the way Silas had taught her to describe structural problems. Not just the solution, but the reason for the solution, so the person understood what they were solving rather than just following instructions they couldn't evaluate. Warren listened to all of it. When she was done, he said, "Can you show me?" She showed him. By noon, she had assessed 4 buildings and was working on the 5th when Dorothea found her and said that Gus needed his leg set properly and would she come, not because she was a medical person, Dorothea was clear on that, but because Gus was asking for someone to hold his hand, and he didn't have family in Harwick, and had specifically asked for the woman from the cabin. She went. She held Gus's hand, which was large and rough and shaking, while Dorothea set the bone with the particular efficient brutality of someone who has done this before and knows that the kindest thing is to be fast. Gus made a sound she would not describe and gripped her hand hard enough to leave marks, and she held on and said his name twice until the sound stopped, and Dorothea said there in the tone of a person who has completed a task. Just lay back on the pile of coats that was his bed in the mill, where the uninjured survivors were being housed, and looked up at the ceiling and breathed carefully. After a minute, he said, "Cornelius is going to want to talk to you." "I know," Abigail said. "He's been—" Gus stopped. He seemed to be choosing words with more care than he usually applied to them. "He's been quiet since the cabin. He's not usually quiet." She looked at Gus's face. He was 60 or so, with the permanent weathered look of someone who has spent decades outdoors. and he had the specific loyalty in his face of a man who has worked for the same person long enough that the employer's complexity has become familiar and no longer requires justification. He was not asking her to be understanding about Cornelius. He was just, she thought, reporting a fact that seemed significant to him. "How long have you worked for him?" she asked. 22 years. Gus closed his eyes. He's not a bad man. He's a man who got used to being the one who decided things and forgot that made him responsible for them. She didn't say anything. She thought that was probably the most accurate summary of Cornelius Turner she'd heard, and that it was generous without being dishonest, and that Gus had spent 22 years earning the right to be that precise about it. "You don't have to do anything," Gus said. "About him, I mean. Nobody's going to think, whatever he asks you, you're allowed to say no." She squeezed his hand once and let it go. "Rest," she said. "I'll come back and check on you." She found Cornelius at the Turner store. I was standing in front of it on the street side, looking at the collapsed center section. The daylight made it worse than it had been in the dark and the storm. You could see the specifics of the failure clearly now, the way the center beam had split along a defect in the wood and brought the roof section straight down, and the way the two end sections had held because they were bearing their loads on separate structural lines. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath coming in regular white puffs, and he had the look of a man who is making an accounting. She stood beside him and looked at the building with the same attention she'd given Warren's house. She looked at the roof line and the wall lines and the foundation stones and the structural logic of what was standing versus what had failed. The assessment came naturally now, the same way reading grain in a log came naturally. She'd learned it by doing it, badly at first, and better as she went. And now it was just a way of looking at the world that she hadn't had in November. The center beam was undersized for the span, she said, or it was sized right and had a defect in it that nobody caught. Either way, the snow load was too much for it. She paused. The end sections can be saved. The center has to come down properly before you rebuild it. You can't build on a failure. You have to clear it first. Cornelius said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the building the way she'd been looking at things for 3 months, trying to see its bones. "I need to rebuild it," he said. "I know." He was quiet again. A longer quiet this time, the kind that has something specific in it. She waited. "I need someone who knows how to build it right," he said. He said it to the building rather than to her. "The man who built it originally. He's been gone for 10 years. I don't have anyone in town who does this kind of work." Another pause. "Silas is a blacksmith. He can do metal work, but the structure itself—" "You're asking me to supervise the rebuild," she said. He turned to look at her then, full on, the way he hadn't looked at her since the morning he'd given her until sundown. His face had changed, not dramatically, not in the way of a man who has undergone a transformation, but in the specific way of a man who is in the process of one, and resisting parts of it and accepting others, which was more honest than a complete transformation would have been. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She thought about several things rapidly. About Gus saying you're allowed to say no. About Marcus whose grave had 3-day-old dirt on it when this man had thrown her into the cold. About the 5 silver coins and the burlap sack, and the bedroom that wasn't hers. She thought about Thomas, the 9-year-old boy, and the way Cornelius had played word games with him through 2 nights of storm. She thought about Gus saying he's not a bad man, which was not the same thing as saying he was a good one. She thought about what she actually wanted, which she had not thought about in a long time because she'd been too busy staying alive to have the luxury of wanting things. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face shifted. He'd expected, she could see it, negotiation about money, or perhaps refusal, or perhaps some version of the confrontation that the moral logic of the situation seemed to call for. He hadn't expected conditions stated in that particular flat voice, which was the voice of a person conducting a business transaction. "What conditions?" he said. "I choose the materials. I don't cut corners on foundation work or on structural lumber because those are the things that fail in storms. You've seen what that looks like." She watched his face. "I set the timeline. I will not rush work that needs time. And I need 2 men to work under me. I'll direct, but I need hands. Good ones." I was quiet. She could see him running it, the cost of the materials, the length of the timeline, the unfamiliar experience of someone else setting the terms on his own building. "Beach is good with his hands," he said finally. "I can get you Beach. And there's a young man, The one you extracted from the building, Joseph. His arm will be out of commission for a month, but after that, Joseph's fine, she said. After his arm heals. All right, Cornelius said. She looked at the failed building one more time. She was already drawing it in her head. Not the reconstruction of what had been there before, because what had been there before had failed, but something corrected, something with a properly sized center beam and a roof pitch that shed snow load instead of holding it. And foundation stones set with gravel-packed drainage because she had learned, in the hardest possible classroom, what happened when water got under a foundation stone and froze. One more condition, she said. He waited. What you said at Marcus's funeral. She said it without inflection, without weight in her voice, because she'd thought about how she wanted to say this, and she'd decided that weight was the wrong approach. She didn't want to wound him. She wanted to be precise. About my size. About what I was worth to this family. I need you to understand that those words were wrong, not because of what happened after, but because they were wrong when you said them. Whether I'd survived or not. Whether this cabin had held or not. She looked at him. I need to know you understand that. He held her gaze. It cost him something. She could see that, the specific cost of looking clearly at a thing you'd done that you can't undo and acknowledging it without qualification. I understand that, he said. It wasn't an apology. She hadn't asked for an apology, and she wasn't sure an apology from Cornelius Turner would have been a real thing rather than a performed one. What he said was smaller than an apology and more reliable than one because it was just an acknowledgement of a fact rather than an emotional production, and facts were what she dealt in now. Good, she said. I'll start the assessment of the salvageable materials tomorrow morning. The rebuild took 11 weeks. This was longer than Cornelius had expected and exactly as long as Abigail had known it would take, and the gap between those two timelines produced, in the first 2 weeks, a tension that was not comfortable but was manageable. Cornelius had the habit of appearing at the worksite in the mornings, with the look of a man calculating progress against schedule, and Abigail had the habit of explaining, when he did this, exactly why the work was taking the time it was taking and what the consequence would be of taking less time. And after 3 or 4 of these exchanges, something shifted in their working dynamic. Not warmth, not friendship, but the particular functional respect of two people who have found that they can be honest with each other without the conversation falling apart. Beach was, as Cornelius had said, good with his hands. Better than good. He had an instinct for wood that Abigail recognized because she'd been developing the same instinct for the past 3 months. And he had it by nature rather than necessity, which made him faster than she'd expected. He also had the quality of a person who takes instruction without ego, which was rarer than the physical skill and more valuable, because Abigail's instruction was sometimes wrong, and the ability to implement a correction without drama saved them both time. She made mistakes. Several of them. The first joist cut for the new center span was 3 inches short because she'd mismeasured the beam pocket depth, and she caught it before it was installed. But the wasted lumber was the wasted lumber, and she felt it as the particular frustration of someone who knows better and did it wrong anyway. She said this aloud, which was new behavior for her. She'd gotten into the habit, working alone on the cabin, of narrating her errors as a way of fixing them in her understanding, and she carried the habit into the worksite without thinking about it. Beach, who'd been watching her measure the short joist with his arms folded, said, "My father used to say measure 3 times, and you'll still get it wrong once." "That's not encouraging," she said. "It wasn't meant to be, it was meant to be true." He looked at the joist. "We can scarf it if you have a piece that'll cover the difference. Won't be pretty, but it'll be sound." She had a piece. The scarf joint took an extra hour, but the joist went in solid, and the structural logic was unchanged, and she filed the wasted time in the same place she filed every other cost of learning. Paid, not recoverable, worth what it bought. The center beam was the critical piece. She spent 4 days on the center beam. She walked the mill road twice looking at available timber before she found what she wanted. A white oak, straight-grained, no visible defects, felled the previous year and dried since then. She had Silas check her arithmetic on the beam sizing because she trusted her judgment, but she trusted Silas's more on load calculations. And he looked at her numbers and said they were correct, and then looked at them again and said they were correct a second time, which was his version of enthusiastic endorsement. She and Beach cut and shaped the beam together. It took a day and a half. When it was done, she ran her palm along the bearing face the way she'd seen Silas run his palm along work he was evaluating, slow, feeling for irregularities. And it was true. Installing the center beam was the day she would remember longest. It required the beam to be raised to its final height, 11 feet, and set into the notched beam pockets at each end wall, and it weighed enough that 3 people could barely manage it under normal conditions. And these were not normal conditions, because January had given way to a February that was not significantly warmer, and the footing was treacherous, and she needed the beam in position before the pocket mortise could shift from the freeze-thaw. She and Beach and Joseph, whose arm had healed to the point of light use, against Dorothea's wishes and with the specific stubbornness of a young man who found inactivity intolerable, raised the beam. She would not characterize it as smooth. She would not characterize it as anything other than what it was. 3 people doing something that was at the edge of what 3 people could do, with the specific awful clarity of a moment where, if something went wrong, the consequences were immediate and significant. The beam went into the east pocket first, Beach holding his end up with his entire body, his face the color of beet, and then the west pocket, Joseph and Abigail with the west end on their shoulders, and her voice saying now, "Rotate, hold," and then it was seated. Both pockets. The beam resting on its bearings, level, carrying nothing yet but ready to carry everything. She stood under it and looked up at it. A piece of white oak she'd chosen and shaped and hung. "That's in," Beach said, still breathing hard. "That's in," she said. Joseph sat down on a barrel and looked at his arm, which he was holding carefully. "I may have done something inadvisable," he said. "You did," Abigail said. "Did it hurt?" "Enormously." "Good. Now you know where your actual limit is instead of your imagined one." She went to look at his arm. "If Dorothea asks, I'm not responsible for what you did to yourself." "That seems fair," Joseph said. He was 19, she'd learned, and from a farming family 2 territories east that he'd left at 17 with no particular plan, which described the origin story of approximately a third of the people in Harwick. He had a quality that she couldn't quite name. A readiness, maybe, a kind of forward-leaning attention to the world around him that was not recklessness, but was adjacent to it, and would either serve him very well or get him seriously hurt, and might do both sequentially. He'd started asking her questions the second week of the rebuild. Not about the specific tasks, about the reasoning behind them. Why did she use green wood for the temporary bracing instead of dry? Why did the roof pitch need to be steeper on the north side than the south? Why did she put gravel under the foundation stones instead of packing clay, which was what the original builder had used? She answered him. She answered him the way Hazel and Silas had answered her, directly, with the logic attached. So the answer was also the reason, and you could evaluate one against the other. She'd had a good education in that pedagogy. She passed it on the same way. The letter arrived from the Territorial Land Office on a Tuesday in late February, delivered by a writer who'd come up from the capital and who seemed surprised, though he managed it professionally, to find the person he was looking for supervising 2 men in the framing of a rebuilt commercial structure. The letter was addressed to the woman known as Abigail Turner, currently residing on the northern ridge above Harwick. The specificity of that address, not a street, not a house number, just her name and the ridge, told her something about how she was being described in reports that were reaching the capital. She read it standing at the worksite with sawdust on her coat and a pencil behind her ear. It was from a man named Aldous Fry, Associate Commissioner for Territorial Settlement. It said, with the careful language of government correspondence, that the Commissioner's office had received several reports regarding the blizzard of the past January, including accounts of a structure on the northern ridge that had sheltered a significant number of survivors, and accounts of the extraction operation conducted during the storm, and accounts of structural assessment work currently being conducted in Harwick by a woman who appeared to have expertise in frontier construction. The Commissioner's office was interested in meeting with this individual at her earliest convenience to discuss matters relating to territorial building standards and settler guidance. She read it twice. Then she put it in her coat pocket and went back to the roof pitch she'd been calculating. Beach, who had seen her reading it, waited until they'd finished the calculation before he said, "Something wrong?" "No," she said. "Government wants to talk to me." He looked at her. "About what?" "Building," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You going to go?" She looked at the center beam above her, solid in its pockets, carrying the weight of the new roof framing she and Beach had been setting since Monday. She thought about November. She thought about 5 silver coins and a land deed and a cabin that listed to the left and smelled like rot and cold. Yes, she said, but not until this roof is done. Cornelius came to find her the following week. She was at the mill with Silas, who had been helping her source a specific type of iron hardware for the new store's door frames, heavy strap hinges, made to a standard that Silas said he could forge, but that she was trying to source commercially first, because commercially forged was faster, and Silas's time was already spoken for by everyone in the territory who needed metalwork done. They'd been discussing the specifications for 20 minutes with the particular engaged disagreement of two people who are both right about different aspects of the same question. Cornelius stood in the mill doorway and waited, which she registered as significant because he was not a man who waited in doorways for conversations to conclude. He waited until Silas wrapped up the specification question. They'd settled on Silas forging 2 of the 4 and sourcing 2 commercially, which was the kind of compromise that neither of them loved, but both of them could live with. And then he came forward. He looked at Silas, and something passed between the two men that Abigail couldn't fully read, but that had the quality of prior communication, as though Cornelius had come here because Silas had told him to, or had known he would be here, or both. "The commissioner's office wrote to you," Cornelius said. "Word travels," she said. "This is a small territory." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I want to say something that I should have said 3 weeks ago and didn't because I don't do this easily." He stopped, started again. "What you did during the storm. The people you got out of my building." He paused. "Margaret, the 11-year-old girl, unconscious, wrong temperature, rope under her arms through a window in the dark and the wind." "She's well?" Abigail said. "She's well," Cornelius said. "She's staying with Dorothea for now. She doesn't have people in Harwick. She came through with a wagon family in October and they moved on before the winter." He paused. "I've been paying for her board. I don't say that I'm not saying it for credit. I'm saying it because it's what's happening, and I think you'd want to know." Abigail looked at him. She thought, 60-something years old, and he is still learning how to be what he should have been. And the feeling that came with that thought was not contempt, and was not forgiveness, and was not sympathy, but was something quieter and more complicated than any of those. The feeling of looking at a person who is working, late, on something they should have started earlier, and recognizing the work for what it is, even if you can't change the timing. "She needs stability," Abigail said. "Somewhere consistent, not just bored." "I know that," he said. And then, unexpectedly, "Ruth Beach has offered to take her permanently. She and Ben can't have more children. They'd been talking about it before the storm." He looked at the window, not at Abigail. "I'm going to contribute to her schooling, whatever that costs." She held that for a moment. A girl who'd almost died in a collapsed building in a blizzard being taken in by a woman who'd organized 29 survivors in a 12 by 14 cabin without being asked. The world arranging itself imperfectly around the edges of a disaster. "That's good," she said. "That's the right thing." He nodded. He seemed to be running out of the things he'd come to say, which she could see in his face, the slight deflation of a person who has prepared for a longer conversation and found that the other person has met them at a shorter one. She waited. "The store will be done when?" he said, switching to business the way he switched to business, which was with the directness of a man who finds business comfortable and almost everything else less so. "End of March if the weather cooperates," she said. "Maybe first week of April." "And then?" She looked at him. "And then it's your store and you run it." "And you?" He was asking about the territorial commissioner, about what came after Harwick. She could see it in the specific focus of the question. "I'll see what the commissioner's office wants," she said. "It's a meeting, not a contract." Silas, who had been quiet and present throughout this exchange, in the way he was quiet and present throughout most things, said, "She'll go and they'll offer her something and she'll decide what it's worth." He said it as simple prediction. "She's been deciding what things are worth for the past 4 months. She's gotten good at it." Cornelius looked at Silas and then at Abigail with the expression of a man who is watching and understanding. He doesn't fully have being confirmed by people who do have it. "I see," he said, which was honest. The store was finished on the 29th of March. She knew the date because she'd been counting days the way she'd learned to count them on the ridge. Not by calendar, but by accumulation, by the running total of things done against things remaining. The last day was the door hardware. Silas's forged straps, heavy and true, mounted with the specific precision that Silas applied to all his work. which was the precision of someone for whom a wrong measurement was a personal offense. She and Silas hung the doors together in the late afternoon, testing the swing, adjusting the hinge leaves, checking that the latch threw cleanly. When both doors were hung and swinging correctly, she stood back and looked at the building. It was not what it had been. It was better than what it had been. The roofline was correct now, the pitch calculated properly, the center beam sized for the load, the sheathing laid with the overlaps running in the right direction so water ran off rather than in. The foundation stones were set with gravel-packed drainage. The wall logs had new chinking where the old had failed and new corner notching where the old joints had opened. She'd built into it everything she'd learned, every mistake and correction from the cabin, every piece of instruction from Hazel and Silas. The drain logic from December, the foundation reset she'd done in March when the ground softened, the roof lesson from the loose shake in the January storm. She'd built a store that could survive the next one, and the one after that. Cornelius came out and stood beside her and looked at it. "It's better than it was," he said. "Yes," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Marcus would have, he started and stopped. She heard the stop, the cutoff, the thing he'd begun to say, and then decided wasn't his to say. She let it stay cut off. It was probably true, whatever it was, and it didn't need to be finished to be true. "The commissioner's office," he said instead. "When are you going?" "Next week," she said. "I need to get up to the cabin first and check the southeast corner. The foundation reset needs to be looked at after the first full thaw." She paused. "And I want to see Hazel." He nodded. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope and held it out to her. She took it. Inside were coins, not silver, gold, more than she'd expected and more than they'd agreed on. She looked at it and then at him. "The agreed amount is in there," he said. "The rest is," he seemed to search for the word, "the difference between what I owe you professionally and what I owe you otherwise. I am aware that they're not the same amount." She held the envelope. She thought about 5 silver coins on a land office desk. She thought about 3 months of cornmeal and blistered hands and a chimney rebuilt from cold ash and collapsed stone. She thought about what gold coins bought in terms of the future she was building, slowly, one thing at a time. "Thank you," she said. He turned to go, then stopped, turned back, with the manner of a man who has one more thing and has not decided until this moment whether to say it. "I told people after the storm," he said, "at the mill, at Dorothea's, at the church. I told them what I said at Marcus's funeral and what I said the morning I—" He stopped again. "I told them it was wrong, publicly." He looked at her with those direct eyes, less certain now than they'd been 3 months ago, which she thought was probably an improvement. "I don't know if it changes anything." She held his gaze. "Changes what you are when you said it," she said. "It doesn't change that you said it." He thought about that. "That's fair," he said. Yes, that's fair." He walked away up the street and she watched him go with the envelope of gold coins in her hand, and the completed building behind her and the ridge above the town where her cabin was, and the drain Silas had helped her cut, and the foundation stone they'd reset together in March, and the chimney she'd rebuilt with her own clay in November, when her hands were soft enough to blister, and her body was an inventory of things she hadn't known it could do. She met with Aldous Fry of the Territorial Commissioner's office on the second Tuesday in April, in a government building in the capital that smelled like pine resin and new plaster, the smell of a place that was still figuring out what it was going to be. Fry was a trim man in his 50s with the careful manner of a bureaucrat who has learned to take people's measure quickly and revise it when the evidence requires. He revised his measure of Abigail within about 5 minutes of the meeting beginning, which she could see in the slight adjustment of his posture when she started answering his questions. He'd come in expecting to talk to a survivor and found himself talking to a builder, which required a different kind of attention. He had reports. He spread them on the table. Accounts from Harwick's residents, from the mail rider who'd been in the territory during the storm, from the territorial surveyor who'd come through in February to assess the storm damage. He pointed at figures. 29 survivors sheltered in a privately owned structure on the northern ridge. 6 people extracted from a collapsed commercial building during the storm itself. Subsequent structural assessment of 11 residential and commercial buildings in Harwick. "You have no formal training," he said. Not as an accusation, as a thing he was trying to understand. "No," she said. You built the cabin on the ridge starting in November with no prior construction experience. I had some. My father built his own house. I watched. She paused. And I had good neighbors. He looked at her over the reports. The Territorial Settlement Office is developing building standards for new construction in frontier settlements. We've lost 7 structures this winter to preventable failures: undersized beams, poor foundation work, inadequate roof pitch for snow load. We want someone to help us develop the standards and then help us communicate them to settlers who are building right now, before the next winter. He folded his hands. We've been looking for someone with practical experience, someone who has actually built in these conditions, made the mistakes, fixed them, and can explain the why of it, not just the what. She looked at him. You want me to help write the standards? And go into the field, visit settlement sites, assess what's being built, and whether it'll survive. He paused. There would be compensation. Government rate, which is not generous, but it's consistent. She thought about this cabin on the ridge, about Hazel's bread with the flavor she'd never identified, about Silas's father's draw knife, well made, meant to be used, about Joseph asking questions all through February and receiving answers, the way she'd received answers from people who didn't have to give them. I need to be able to go back to Harwick when I'm needed, she said. And I keep the cabin. It's mine. Of course, Fry said. And I write the standards the way I know them to be right, she said. Not the way they're easier to write. Foundation drainage, beam sizing, roof pitch. These are not items you can suggest. They need to be required. He looked at her for a moment. That will be a harder sell to settlers who think they know better. Most settlers who think they know better are living in buildings that'll fail in the next bad winter, she said. The sell gets easier after the 3rd or 4th collapse. Fry almost smiled. I don't know whether that's optimistic or pessimistic. It's accurate, she said, which is more useful than either. He extended his hand across the table. She shook it. Her hand was not soft. It had not been soft in a long time. He registered this. She could see it, the slight surprise of a man expecting one thing and finding another in a handshake. And she did not comment on it, and neither did he. She was going to think about that later, on the road back to Harwick, on the day she came back up the ridge to the cabin and checked the southeast corner and found the drain running clear and the foundation stone solid in its repacked gravel bed, holding steady against the last of the winter's damage. She was going to think about that handshake and what was in it. Not pride, still not quite pride, but something that had been becoming itself for 5 months and had finally, in a government office that smelled like new plaster, arrived at its proper name. She was a builder. She had always been one, probably. She just needed somewhere hard enough to find out. She repacked the southeast corner with fresh gravel, 2 inches more depth on the low side, evening the bearing surface, and she pressed the foundation stone down into it and tested it with both palms, and it did not move. She sat back in the spring mud of her own yard and looked up at the cabin and at the chimney she'd rebuilt in November with her own clay, and at the door that opened and closed the way a door was supposed to, and at the roof she'd relaid and resealed and from which not a single drop had come down during the worst storm in living memory. It was not a perfect cabin. There was still a place near the loft ladder where the floor was slightly off level, not enough to trip on, but enough to notice if you were looking. The west wall shims would need to be checked every fall, always, because the soil there had a particular drainage pattern that would always want to shift. The loft, which she'd repaired twice now, would need another board replaced in the next year or two. Not perfect. Solid. There was a difference, and she had learned it the hard way, the only way anyone really learned it, and the difference was this. Perfect was a thing you aimed at and never reached, and solid was a thing you built from the reality of what you had and what you knew and what you were willing to fix when it broke. Solid was the thing that held 29 people in a blizzard. Solid was the thing that was there when you came back to it, when you needed it, when the spring mud was on your hands and the work ahead of you was longer than the work behind. She stood up. She went inside and built a fire in the chimney that drew clean and straight, and she put water on and sat down on the level floor and thought about the building standards she was going to help write, and about the settlements she was going to visit, and about all the people out there right now building things that would either hold or fail, depending on whether someone told them the difference between a beam that was sized right and a beam that was sized for convenience. The water heated. The fire burned. The cabin held. 3 years passed the way hard years do. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular weight of time that is being used rather than spent. Abigail made the ride between Harwick and the capital 11 times in those 3 years. She learned the road the way she'd learned the cabin, by its problems first, the section near the creek crossing that turned to mud in spring thaw, the exposed ridge stretch where the wind came sideways in November, the way station at the halfway point run by a woman named Cora who made coffee that was barely distinguishable from hot mud, but who always had a dry stall for the horse and asked no questions about where you were going or why. She learned it until it was hers, until her body knew the landmarks before her eyes found them. The building standards took 8 months to write. Not because the knowledge was complicated, most of it was simple, almost insultingly simple, the kind of thing that seemed obvious once you'd watched a beam fail under snow load or a foundation stone migrate through 3 freeze-thaw cycles. The complication was in the writing itself, in finding language precise enough to be useful and plain enough that a settler who'd never built anything more complex than a fence could read it and understand what was required and why. She wrote it, and Fry's office rewrote it, and she rewrote it again 3 times, until the final document was 22 pages and covered foundation drainage, beam sizing tables, roof pitch minimums, wall chinking standards, chimney construction requirements, and the specific problem of corner notching in log construction, which was where most frontier buildings failed first. Sheffield tested it herself. That was the part of the work with Fry's office that she'd insisted on, not just writing standards at a desk in the capital, but going to the settlements and looking at what was actually being built and comparing it against what the standards required. She visited 14 settlements in the first year. She found, in those 14 settlements, the same errors repeating with the consistency of things that happen when people don't know what they don't know. Foundation stones set in clay without drainage, center beams undersized by a third, roof pitches too shallow for the snow loads common at higher elevations. She found one settlement where an entire row of 4 houses had been built with the corner notching reversed, which meant the logs were shedding water inward instead of outward, and all 4 would have had serious rot problems within 2 winters. She fixed what she could fix and documented what she couldn't, and went home and added what she'd found to the standards, and the cycle began again. Joseph came to work for her formally in the second year. She hadn't planned it. He'd appeared at the cabin in late April with his arm fully healed and a request that was half question and half statement, in the way of someone who has made up their mind and is presenting the decision as negotiable out of politeness rather than genuine uncertainty. "I want to learn what you know," he said. "All of it. Not just the tasks, the reasoning." She was sitting on her porch resetting a loose board, which was the kind of maintenance the cabin required regularly and which she'd stopped finding tedious because it was simply the ongoing conversation between her and a structure she knew well. She looked at Joseph, 20 now, with the same forward-leaning readiness he'd always had, and thought about what it would mean to take on an apprentice, which she had no experience with. "It'll take years," she said. "I have years," he said. "You'll make the same mistakes I made, some of them twice." "Probably," he said. "You gonna hold that against me?" She thought about Hazel, who had come down the path on her first night with bean soup and the instruction small fires and had proceeded, without any formal agreement, to teach her everything she needed to know to stay alive on that ridge. She thought about Silas, who had walked the perimeter of her cabin looking for foundation problems without being asked. She thought about the way knowledge moved, not in formal transactions, but in the particular human habit of one person who knows something and another person who needs it, and the space between them where the knowing gets passed across. "Start Monday," she said. "You'll work the field visits first. I need someone who can look at a foundation stone and tell me what's wrong with it before I tell you what's wrong with it." He was there Monday, before she'd finished her coffee. Hazel Boone died in the 3rd winter. She died the way she'd lived, without ceremony and without warning, going to sleep one night in late December and not waking up. Silas found her in the morning and came down to the cabin to tell Abigail, and she could see in his face that he'd been carrying the news for a few hours already. The specific look of someone who is accustomed to managing things, and is managing this too, and doing it imperfectly, which was the most human thing about him. She didn't say anything immediately useful. She said his name, and she put her hand on his arm, and they stood in the doorway of her cabin for a moment in the cold, which was all that needed to happen right then. The funeral was small. Hazel had wanted it small, had specified this in a handwritten note Silas found in the tin box where she kept important documents. The note was also a list of practical instructions. Who got the iron cookware? what to do with the medicinal herbs in the root cellar, that the two chickens should go to Ruth Beach, because Ruth's children would take care of them properly. The note said nothing about grief, which was entirely consistent with Hazel Boone, and which was, Abigail thought, its own kind of statement about what the old woman had believed mattered. Abigail inherited this bread recipe. It was in the same tin box, folded small, written in Hazel's compressed handwriting, caraway seed and dried fennel, ground together, a half teaspoon per loaf. So it had been fennel after all, and Silas had been right, and neither of them had known. She made the bread the following Sunday. It tasted right. It tasted like the particular comfort of a thing you've received from someone who didn't have to give it, and the fennel and caraway together had a flavor she had no better word for than Hazel, which was not a flavor anyone else would recognize, but which was exact. She brought a loaf to Silas without announcing she was going to. She left it on his workbench while he was out and walked back up the ridge. And when he came by the cabin 2 days later, he didn't mention the bread, and neither did she, but something between them settled slightly, the way a foundation settles when the gravel pack is right. Not movement toward instability, but toward it. The question of Silas took the better part of 2 years to resolve, which was appropriate given that both of them were people who moved carefully and didn't like to make decisions they hadn't thought through. There was no single moment. There was instead an accumulation, the same accumulation that had turned a ruined cabin into a home, one fixed thing at a time, of mornings when he arrived before she'd said she needed him, and evenings when neither of them moved toward the door when the reasonable hour for leaving had passed. There was a day in the second spring when they were resetting the southeast foundation stone, the job he'd said they'd do properly when the ground was soft, and here they were doing it, 2 years and 1 winter after he'd first identified the problem, and working in the particular silence of people who are comfortable enough to not feel it. And she looked at his hands in the gravel pack and thought, I have been looking at these hands for 2 years and I am not tired of them. That was the thought. That simple and that specific. She told him on a Thursday evening in March when the cabin was warm and the fennel bread was cooling and neither of them had made any move toward the door. She said, I am not interested in being anyone's widow again. If that's the direction this is going, I need to know that you understand what you're getting into. He looked at her. Those careful black eyes, the ones that had been looking at foundation stones and roof lines and her hands and her face for 2 years. I understand, he said, and I'm not interested in being anyone's grief project. If Marcus is still, Marcus is 3 years gone, she said. I loved him. I buried him. Those are both true and they don't change what's here. She looked at him steadily. What's here is different from what that was. I'm different. You're not Martha's Silas, and I'm not Marcus's Abigail. We're whatever we are. I was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started to think she'd read it wrong, that the accumulation she'd been cataloging had been something else, that she'd made the particular error of confusing proximity for intention. Then he said, I'd want to be at the cabin. I'd want to stay on the ridge. I live on the ridge, she said. There's nowhere else I'd be. He looked at the southeast corner she'd packed and the chimney she'd rebuilt, and the door that hung true after 2.5 years of use. He looked at all of it the way he always looked at structures, with the evaluating patience of someone who takes the long view on things meant to last. All right, he said. Which was not, she thought, the most romantic thing anyone had ever said. But it was Silas, and it was true. And those were the same thing. Oh. On a morning in her 4th autumn on the ridge, Abigail sat on the porch of her cabin with the second mug of coffee. Silas had the first one and had left before dawn to open the smithy and watched 3 riders come up the trail. She knew the type before they reached her. Young men, maybe 20 to 23, with the particular combination of eagerness and uncertainty that characterized people who were about to build their first serious structure and had heard, somewhere, that there was a woman on the northern ridge who knew things worth knowing. They came in groups usually because the climb was easier with company and the nervousness was easier shared. She waited until they dismounted and introduced themselves. Brothers, 2 of them, and a third man who was a cousin from 2 territories east, and they were building a settlement structure, a combined store and meeting hall, and they'd heard that, Sit down, she said. The bench on the left side of the porch holds 3 people. The right side has a loose board, second from the end. Don't lean on it. I'm replacing it this week. They sat on the left side. She poured more coffee. She looked at the oldest one, who had the look of the person who'd organized this trip. Tell me about your soil, she said, where you're building. what it does when it rains. He blinked. We haven't really. Start there, she said. Everything else comes from what your soil does when it rains. They stayed for 4 hours. She drew in the dirt with a stick, and she talked, and they asked questions. Good ones, bad ones, the ones that revealed what they didn't know. They didn't know. And she answered all of them the way she'd been taught to answer, with the logic attached. So the answer and the reason arrived together and could be evaluated against each other. When they left, the oldest one, his name was Reed, stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and turned back. He had the expression of someone who has received more than they expected and is trying to account for it. People in town said you were the one to come to, he said. They said you were the woman who survived the big blizzard, who sheltered everyone. He paused. I thought it would be a different kind of story, about the storm. She looked at him from the porch. The chimney was above her, the clay she'd packed into it that first November, still solid after 4 years. The door behind her was the door she'd rehung so it closed right. The southeast corner drain ran clear. The storm is one night, she said. Everything before the storm is what determines whether you survive it. She picked up her coffee. Go check your soil. Come back when you know what it does when it rains. They went down the path. She heard them talking as they went, the sound of it blending with the wind in the pines and then gone. She sat on the porch and looked at the ridge above her and the sky over it, and the particular quality of October light that came through the trees at this hour, which was the kind of light that made everything look like it was being seen clearly for the first time. She thought about what she was. Not the woman Cornelius Turner had put out with a burlap sack and 5 silver coins. Not Marcus's wife. Not the large woman whose body people had narrated as her most important fact. She was a woman who knew what soil did when it rained and what a beam needed to carry a load and what a chimney sounded like when the mortar was failing and what a door frame needed to hang true. She was a woman who had made herself useful, then necessary, then something harder to name. The person people came to before they built, before the storm, before the failure, which was better than coming after. She was not finished. That was the other thing she knew, sitting on that porch in October with the coffee going cold in her hand. She was not finished being built, either. There were still mistakes ahead of her that she hadn't made yet, and things she didn't know that she didn't know yet, and problems she'd encounter in the next settlement visit that would require her to revise something she'd thought was settled. She was not a completed structure. She was a structure in progress, maintained and adjusted and occasionally wrong and always, in the end, standing. That was enough. That was, she had come to understand, exactly what enough looked like. Not completion, not perfection, not the absence of loose boards and settling stones, but the willingness to get up in the morning and address what needed addressing, one thing at a time, for as long as there were things that needed it. She went inside. The fire needed feeding. The loose board on the right side of the porch needed replacing before the week was out. Joseph was coming Thursday with questions about the new settlement survey. Silas would be back by evening. The cabin held. It had always held once she'd made it hers. Not by luck or by grace or by anyone's permission, but by work and patience and the refusal to let the cold have the last word. She fed this fire and got out